She was standing over a man with blood on her hands when she finally understood what it meant to be free. 8 guns, 6 women who had stopped believing anyone was coming, and a school teacher from Boston with 9 cents in her pocket and 3 broken ribs who had just decided that none of that was going to be enough to stop her. This is how she got there. She was standing over a man with blood on her hands when she finally understood what it meant to be free. The mine shaft dropped 300 feet into the Montana earth, and the darkness down there had its own weight, its own smell, something ancient and indifferent that had been waiting long before any of them had arrived and would keep waiting long after. 6 women stood behind her. 8 guns pointed at her from the shadows. And somewhere behind a chunk of granite that had saved his life by 3 inches, Lucas Mercer was bleeding out from a wound that had no business letting him stay upright. Abigail Brennan stood in the center of all of it. Her hands were empty. Her dress was torn at the shoulder and dark with soot along between. 3 broken ribs that had never healed correctly sent white fire through her left side with every breath she drew. She took 1 step forward toward the man with the guns, then another. People would ask her later, after the trial and the hanging and the long quiet winter that followed, whether she had been afraid. She would think about that question for longer than it deserved. Then she would answer the same way every time. When you have already lost everything, she would say, when you have already touched the bottom and found out that the bottom holds, there is nothing left to be afraid of. And that more than courage, more than righteousness, more than anything a person could plan or prepare is what makes a woman dangerous. But to understand how a school teacher from Boston arrived in a Montana mining camp in September of 1876 with nothing but a torn dress and a journal hidden inside her corset, standing between 8 loaded guns and 6 women who had given up on being saved, we need to go back to the beginning of it. We need to go back to the stagecoach. This is the story of a woman who was sold before she ever arrived, who was promised a husband and given a ledger entry instead, who came west because east had closed every door it had and she had run out of walls to put her back against, who arrived in a town called Copper Bend, Montana with 9 cents in her coat pocket, a bruise on her left cheek that was 10 days old and still the color of a storm cloud, and 3 ribs that a man named James Hartford had broken 6 weeks before she boarded that train. In the next 2 hours, you will watch her go from a woman who flinched at the sound of footsteps to a woman who walked through fire, literally and otherwise, to pull strangers out of the dark. You will watch a cowboy who had been dead inside for 3 years discover that grief and living are not the same thing, no matter how convincingly they imitate each other. And you will watch a town that had chosen silence over justice finally find its voice, one person at a time, beginning with a Chinese restaurant owner who had been keeping a list for 2 years and a one-eyed reverend who understood that bearing witness and doing nothing are 2 sides of the same cowardice. The clock started before Abigail knew it was running. Silas Drummond's man had been watching the eastern road since the 1st of September. He had the description. He had the approximate arrival date. He had instructions that were clear enough that he never needed to ask for clarification. 3 days. That was how long Abigail had before the next stagecoach departed Copper Bend, heading back towards civilization. 3 days before her only route out of the territory left without her. She did not know this when she stepped down from the coach onto the main street of Copper Bend on the 14th of September, 1876, blinking against the afternoon sun and looking for a man she had never met, but had promised herself to across 1,400 miles of correspondence. She knew almost nothing that mattered, but she was about to start learning. The Montana sky in September has a quality that people from the east are never quite prepared for. It is not merely large. Large is a word for things that can be measured. The sky over the northern Rockies in the last weeks of summer is something that defeats measurement by its simple indifference to being measured at all. It stretches in every direction with the confidence of something that has never needed to impress anyone, and it makes every human structure beneath it look like an apology. Copper Bend sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridgelines, and the town itself looked exactly like what it was, a collection of wooden buildings that had been put up quickly by people who were not sure they were staying, surrounded by mountains that had been there for 10,000 years and would remain for 10,000 more. The main street was packed dirt, the color of dried blood. A general store, a livery stable with a broken hinge on the main door, a bank with pretensions to grandeur suggested by a carved wooden facade that the weather had been working against for several seasons, a saloon called the Silver Dollar with its curtains drawn at 3 in the afternoon, a church at the far end of the street, small and white, and in better repair than anything else in town, which said something about the priorities of whoever maintained it. And in front of the stagecoach depot, a small knot of people who had come to collect mail and goods and whoever the coach was carrying today. Abigail stepped down onto the street and the dust rose around her boots and settled on the hem of her dress, which was dark blue and had been her better dress once, though 14 days of travel had renegotiated that status considerably. She had a single bag. Inside it were two more dresses, a collection of books she could not bring herself to leave in Boston, regardless of the practicalities, her mother's silver brooch, and a packet of letters tied with a blue ribbon that she had read so many times the creases had worn through the paper at the folds. The letters were from Malcolm Pritchard of Copper Bend, Montana, who had written to a matrimonial agency in Boston 7 months ago with a request for a woman of education and good character who was willing to relocate to the Montana Territory and make a life in the West. Malcolm had described himself as a man of business, owner of a general store, 34 years old and widowed, looking for partnership and companionship in equal measure. His letters had been articulate and warm. He had described the town with enthusiasm and the landscape with genuine feeling. He had asked thoughtful questions about her life in Boston and had responded to her answers with what seemed like real curiosity. She had believed every word. She had needed to believe every word. She pressed her left hand against her side as she straightened up from the step, feeling the familiar complaint of the ribs that James Hartford had introduced to his fist on an August evening 2 months before. The pain was manageable now, which was a word she had been applying to a great many things in her life during the preceding year. The bruise on her cheek was her own fault in a manner of speaking. She had turned her head at the wrong moment on the last day and the doorframe had been unkind. That was the story she told herself, and she had been telling it long enough that some mornings it almost felt like the truth. She looked for Malcolm Pritchard in the faces gathered around the stagecoach. She found someone else instead. He was leaning against the post outside the depot with the particular stillness of a man who has no intention of going anywhere, but has also no investment whatsoever in appearing to be waiting. His arms were crossed. His hat was pulled low against the angle of the afternoon sun. He was somewhere in his late 20s, though the quality of stillness around him belonged to someone older or to someone who had experienced enough of the wrong kind of things that the years had been doing double work. 6'1", perhaps. Dark hair that needed cutting, curling slightly at the collar in a way that suggested he was aware of this and had chosen not to care. A scar ran from just below his right ear down to where his collar began, white against skin that the Montana sun had worked on thoroughly. He wore a faded chambray shirt the color of a sky seen through window glass, a tan leather vest over it, and a hat that was black and wide-brimmed and had been places. The revolver on his hip sat there the way a book sits on a familiar shelf, naturally without announcement, as if it had always been there and would always be there, and the question of its presence had simply never required discussion. His eyes were gray. She noticed this from 10 feet away, because they were the kind of gray that is not actually neutral, though, the gray of weather systems moving in from the north, the gray of decisions being made in the dark. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has encountered before and has not yet decided how to solve. Abigail held his gaze for a moment, then looked past him at the remaining faces. Malcolm Pritchard had sent her a daguerreotype. Brown hair going a little thin at the temples, a round face with a quality of optimism about it that the photographic process had somehow managed to capture. Medium height, she had memorized that face over 14 days of train travel and stagecoach rattling, and nights in way stations that smelled of horses and other people's anxiety. None of the faces in front of her were that face. She looked back at the man with the gray eyes. "I'm looking for Malcolm Pritchard," she said. She had been practicing steadiness in her voice for several weeks, the way a person practices an instrument, and she was getting better at it. "He sent for me. We're to be married." The man with the gray eyes looked at her for another moment without changing expression. "Malcolm's gone," he said. 2 words, delivered with the affect of a man commenting on the direction of the wind. Abigail felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Gone where? The ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite irony, not quite pity, something harder than either. That's the question, isn't it? The stagecoach driver was already unloading the mail pouch. In another 2 minutes, the coach would pull away, and she would be standing in the main street of Copper Bend, Montana with 9 cents in her pocket and a future that had just evaporated like morning water on a hot stone. Then the door of the building across the street opened. The woman who came out was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years on either side of that, with quick, efficient movements that suggested she had been watching from the window and had seen enough to know what was needed. She was Chinese with sharp dark eyes that moved from the man with the gray eyes to Abigail and then back again with the economy of someone reading a familiar kind of situation. She wiped her hands on her apron as she crossed the street. "Lucas Mercer," she said. "That girl looks like she's about to fall over." The man Lucas turned his head slightly without taking his eyes off Abigail. "Not my problem, Grace. Everything in this town is your problem, whether you like it or not." "That is categorically false." The woman named Grace reached Abigail and looked at her with the direct, unsentimental appraisal of someone who has seen a great many people in difficulty and has learned to assess the nature of that difficulty quickly and without the interference of sentiment. Her gaze moved to the bruise on Abigail's cheek and stayed there for a fraction of a second. "When did you eat last?" Abigail tried to remember the way the station in Billings. A piece of hard bread the morning before, or perhaps the morning before that. Time had blurred somewhere around the Wyoming border in a way that was becoming a habit. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're half-starved and Malcolm Pritchard is 3 days gone, which means you are in a situation." Grace looked at Lucas. "Are you going to help or just stand there performing indifference?" "I'm not responsible for Malcolm's arrangements." "Nobody said responsible. I said help. There is a difference, and you know it." Lucas Mercer's jaw tightened. The stagecoach pulled away behind Abigail in a cloud of dust, in the sound of hooves, and she felt the last easy option leaving with it. She watched it go without letting her face show what that cost her. Lucas was still looking at her. He looked at the bruise again. Something moved behind those gray eyes, quick and controlled, something harder than sympathy and more complicated than judgment. "There's a room behind the church," he said finally. "Reverend Whitfield takes in strays. Grace will show you." He turned toward his horse. "Wait." Abigail took half a step forward. "You know Malcolm. Where would he go? When will he be back?" Lucas stopped. His shoulders rose and fell with a breath that seemed to cost him something. When he turned back to look at her, his face had gone carefully empty, in the way that faces go empty when the person behind them has practiced a very particular kind of control for a very long time. "Malcolm Pritchard and I are not friends, Miss Brennan. We are not even friendly. If he told you he was a man of his word, he lied about that too." He swung up into the saddle with the kind of movement that speaks not of showmanship, but of 10,000 repetitions, natural as standing. "Welcome to Montana." Then he was riding south out of town, and Abigail was standing in the street with the dust settling around her boots, and Grace Chin was watching her with eyes that had already moved from assessment to something more careful. "Come on," Grace said. "Let's get some food into you before you think too hard about what you've gotten yourself into." The restaurant was small, 6 tables in a room that smelled like coffee and meat frying, and something underneath those things that was warmer and older. The smell of a place that has fed people for long enough that the walls have absorbed a history of meals and conversations and the particular human comfort of being given something to eat when you are hungry. Grace sat Abigail at the back table and went to the kitchen without ceremony. Through the window, Abigail could see the main street of Copper Bend, a man loading barrels outside the livery, a woman hurrying between the bank and the general store with her eyes down, 2 men on the steps of the Silver Dollar Saloon who were not quite looking at her but were not quite not looking at her either, a distinction she had learned to recognize during the past several years. She thought about Malcolm's letters, the thriving town, the successful business, the man ready for a family and a future. She had read those letters until the paper had gone soft at the folds. She had read them on the train west with the flat Ohio farmland giving way to the prairie and then to the first suggestions of mountains, and she had let herself believe them, had used them the way you use a candle in a very dark room, not because you believe the candle will last forever, but because darkness without any light at all is something the human mind cannot navigate for long. She had needed to believe them. That was the part she kept returning to. Not the anger, not the humiliation, not the cold practical terror of being alone in a town where she knew no one with 9 cents in a torn dress. Those things were there, but underneath them, that simple damning truth. She had needed to believe them, and so she had, and now here she was. Grace returned with a plate of eggs and bacon and bread that was still warm. She set it down without ceremony and sat across from Abigail with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a woman who has decided to dispense with the social preliminaries. How much did Malcolm tell you about Copper Bend? He said it was a good town, growing. He said he owned a store. He owns half of a failing store and owes money to people you don't want to owe money to. Grace wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. 3 days ago, he left in the middle of the night. No one has seen him since. The eggs tasted like salvation anyway. Abigail forced herself to keep eating because her body needed it and because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking right now had a particular quality of danger to it. Why didn't anyone warn me? There must have been a way to send word. By the time anyone understood what you were riding into, you were already on the road. Malcolm wasn't the type to share his plans with people who might complicate them, or his debts, especially those. Grace looked at her with something that was not quite admiration and not quite concern, but occupied the space between them. You're going to need work. I can teach. I have a degree from the Boston Latin School. I taught Latin and composition to the daughters of merchants for 3 years. I can also keep books, sew, and organize a household. Grace said nothing for a moment. Then, can you wash dishes? There was a beat of silence. Abigail looked at the woman across from her, at the careful neutrality in those sharp eyes, and she understood that this was not a diminishment. This was an offer which was something that no one in the past several months had made her with any sincerity. Yes, Abigail said, I can wash dishes. 6 days a week, 4 hours a day, 75 cents a week. Grace paused. The room behind the church is free if Reverend Whitfield agrees, but you'll need money for everything else. 75 cents a week was nothing. It was barely enough to sustain a person in a place where the nearest supply of anything was 40 miles of mountain road away. But it was more than 9 cents in hope, and at present it was the best offer available. When do I start? Soon as you finish eating. Grace stood, then paused with her hand on the back of the chair. Abigail. The use of her first name was deliberate, Abigail understood. A statement of something. Lucas Mercer is a hard man, but he is not a cruel one. He lost his wife and his daughter 3 years back. Comanche raided his ranch while he was out on a hunt. He came home to ashes in 2 graves. She let that settle for a moment. He doesn't let people close anymore. Don't take it personally when he looks at you like you're already gone. Abigail set her fork down. She thought about the way those gray eyes had looked at the bruise on her cheek, the way something had moved behind them and been controlled before it could become legible. Why are you telling me this? Grace considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because I've watched 3 other girls come through this town in the past 2 years. All 3 came looking for Malcolm Pritchard, or men like him. All 3 disappeared within a month. She paused. I couldn't do anything about it then. Maybe I can do something now. She walked back to the kitchen. Abigail sat for a long moment with the cooling eggs in front of her. Then she picked up her fork and finished every bite. The Reverend Thomas Whitfield was not what the word reverend suggested. He was thin as a fence rail, white-haired with a face that time and weather had carved into an expression of durable kindness. His left eye was clouded entirely by whatever had taken his sight in it years ago. The right eye, however, saw clearly and saw considerably, and it saw Abigail with the patience of a man who had spent 40 years listening to people tell him the parts of their stories they thought he needed to hear. Miss Brennan, he said when Grace brought her to the small, white church at the edge of town, Grace tells me you are in need of a room. Yes, sir, I can pay something, not much, but something. The room is free. It's barely more than a closet, and the window looks out over the cemetery, which some people find discouraging. His good eye studied her, though I suspect you have seen discouraging before and survived it. A few times. Good. He gestured for her to follow him around the side of the church. I'd offer you the usual pastoral comfort about the Lord working in mysterious ways, but I suspect you have heard enough platitudes to last several lifetimes. Despite everything, despite the 9 cents and the aching ribs and the future that had dissolved that afternoon, like sugar in rain, Abigail felt her mouth pull sideways. You'd be correct about that. The room was exactly as described. Narrow bed with a handmade quilt patches of different fabrics sewn together with the care of someone who had been doing it for a very long time. A washstand, a window that looked directly out over the cemetery which occupied a hillside above the church with a collection of wooden crosses and stone markers standing in the prairie grass at various angles of permanence. One piece of advice, Reverend Whitfield said from the doorway, this town has secrets, and some of them are the biting kind. Don't trust Easy in Copper Bend. I don't trust Easy anywhere. He studied her for a moment longer with that one clear eye. No, he said quietly, I don't imagine you do. He left her there. Abigail stood at the window and looked out at the cemetery in the gathering dusk, and thought about Boston, which she had left with the particular thoroughness of someone burning a bridge rather than crossing one. She thought about her father's study and the rope, and the Tuesday morning in March when she had gone in to call him to breakfast. She thought about her mother's slow disappearance over 3 years of consumption, the way a person can be present and diminishing simultaneously, until one morning they are simply no longer present at all. She thought about James Hartford's smile the first time he had asked her to dinner, and the way that smile had remained technically the same while becoming over the course of the following year something that made her back involuntarily find the nearest wall. Boston was ash in memory. Montana was supposed to be different. She was going to make it different, she decided, standing at that window with the last light dying behind the mountains and the cemetery settling into shadow below her. Not because things had gone well. Things had gone spectacularly, comprehensively badly. But she was still here, and she had a room with a door that locked from the inside, which was an improvement over the past several months, and tomorrow she would start work and begin to understand the shape of the problem. And the problem, she was already certain, was considerably larger than a missing man named Malcolm Pritchard. She did not sleep well. The ribs made every position a negotiation. The wind off the mountains found the gaps in the old church wood and whistled through them with a persistence that was almost conversational. Outside, distant coyotes discussed something among themselves that seemed to require call and response across several ridges. Somewhere around midnight, she heard footsteps in the cemetery. Slow. Deliberate, not furtive, not hurrying, but measured in a way that suggested purpose rather than destination. She moved to the window without lighting the lamp, staying to the side of the frame where she would be invisible from outside. The moon was 3/4 full, and the cemetery was well lit in that particular silver that belongs only to mountain nights, a light that turns everything it touches into something that exists outside of ordinary time. A figure moved between the graves. Tall, male. He stopped near 2 markers that stood close together on the upper part of the hillside, and after a moment he crouched down, one knee on the ground, and became still. She recognized the shape of the hat. Lucas Mercer sat with his dead for a long time. She had no way to measure exactly how long, because time does strange things when you are watching grief that does not know it is being witnessed. He did not move. He did not do anything that she could see. He simply stayed the way you stay, with something that matters, with the patience of a man who has nowhere else to be and nothing else that needs doing. When he finally stood and turned to leave, the moonlight caught his face. The expression she saw there was not grief. She had seen grief. She had worn grief. This was something older and heavier. Something that had been carried for so long that had worn grooves in the person carrying it, become structural load-bearing. Guilt. Not the ordinary guilt of a person who regrets an action. The guilt of a person who has decided somewhere below the level of reason that the thing that happened was their fault, and who has been honoring that decision every day since by refusing to allow themselves anything that resembles comfort. He walked back across the cemetery toward the road, and Abigail stood at the window long after he disappeared from view. She thought about what Grace had told her, about the graves and the ashes and the man who had come home to both, about the way he had looked at the bruise on her face and then looked away. She thought about the 3 girls who had come to Copper Bend and vanished. She thought about the way the 2 men on the silver dollar steps had watched her without watching her. She thought about the name Grace had started to say before stopping herself. Silas Drummond, you need to know that name. She did not know it yet, but she was going to learn it. She went back to the narrow bed and lay down carefully, accounting for the ribs, and stared at the ceiling until sleep came in fragments. Thin and unsatisfying, laced with images that had nothing to do with Montana. Morning arrived cold and precise, the way Montana mornings arrive in September, as if the light itself has been disciplined by the altitude into something cleaner and more demanding than the light of softer places. Abigail dressed in her second dress, which was not much improved over the first, but at least bore no visible evidence of the last weeks of its history. She braided her hair and pinned it with the 3 pins she had left and looked in the small mirror above the washstand at a face that was beginning slowly to look like a person who intended to remain upright. The bruise had faded to yellow-green at the edges. The green eyes above it were clearer than they had been in months, which was a strange thing to notice given the circumstances, but she noticed it anyway. Something about having the worst happen tended to do that. Once the thing you feared most had already arrived, there was a certain clarity available. Grace was in the kitchen when Abigail arrived, working through preparations for the breakfast service with the systematic efficiency of someone for whom the kitchen is not a domestic space, but a place of serious work. "You're early," Grace said without looking up. "Where I come from, early means on time. Where you come from sounds exhausting." A pause that contained what might have been approval. "Coffee's on the stove, then the dishes from last night." Abigail poured her coffee and found the stack of dishes waiting and began to work, and the routine of it, the simple physical rhythm of wash, rinse, dry, stack, was something she had not expected to be grateful for. Her mind needed something to do with its hands while it worked on the larger problem. Boston had taught her that some part of thinking works better when the body is occupied with honest, purposeless effort. She was halfway through the stack when the door opened. The way Lucas Mercer moved through a room was not the way most men move through rooms. Most men, when they enter a space, announce themselves with sound and displacement, the shuffle and scrape of their presence. Lucas entered Grace's restaurant the way weather enters a landscape, not loudly, but making its presence known to everything in the vicinity by a kind of atmospheric adjustment. The temperature in the room did not literally change, but something shifted. He nodded to Grace. The usual. Grace did not respond. She simply began cracking eggs into the skillet, which Abigail was beginning to understand was Grace's highest form of acknowledgement. Lucas took the end seat at the counter with his back to the kitchen and looked out the front window at the morning street. He had not seen Abigail. She considered staying in the kitchen. Invisible was a habit she had developed over the previous year, practiced daily until it became a kind of second nature. The ability to be present in a space without being noticed, which had served certain survival purposes. But invisible was a habit, and habits she was finding had a way of outlasting their usefulness. She dried her hands and walked out into the dining room. "Mr. Mercer." He turned. The surprise was brief and controlled, replaced almost immediately by the careful neutral expression she was already learning to read as his default. "Miss Brennan, I wanted to thank you for suggesting the room at the church yesterday. It wasn't my suggestion. It was Grace's. You stayed long enough to see it arranged." She poured his coffee without waiting to be asked because she was working here and he was a customer, and that was the practical situation regardless of the complicated weather between them. "I need to understand what happened to Malcolm, if there's any chance of the arrangement he described." Lucas looked at the coffee, then at her. The gray eyes moved to the bruise one more time, just briefly, and then away. "Malcolm Pritchard is not coming back, Miss Brennan. If he has any intelligence at all, and Malcolm had some intelligence, though he applied it badly, he is 4 states away by now. He owes money to Silas Drummond. Men who owe Silas money have 2 outcomes available to them." He picked up the coffee. "They run or they don't run far enough." Grace set a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him with slightly more force than the action required. "Leave it alone, Lucas," she asked. "I'm asking you to leave it alone." Grace looked at him with the expression of someone who has been having a version of this conversation for several years. "And I'm asking you to let Carson handle it. Carson is 300 miles away. Then let it wait." But Abigail was not going to let it wait. She had not come 1,400 miles on a set of letters she had wanted to believe had not survived the preceding year with its succession of losses and griefs, and the particular violence of James Hartford's idea of persuasion to stand in a kitchen and let it wait. "Who is Silas Drummond?" Grace went still. The kind of still that is different from the ordinary stillness of a person at rest, the stillness of a person who has just heard a sound they were dreading. Lucas set the coffee down. He seemed to be making a calculation weighing how much truth was owed to a woman who had arrived in his town with a bruised face and 9 cents, who had not run when she had every reason to run, who was standing in front of him asking a direct question with eyes that were not going to accept an evasion. Silas Drummond owns the saloon, the bank, and approximately half the land within 20 miles of Copper Bend. 5 years ago, he killed a farmer over a property dispute. The killing had witnesses. He paused. I was one of them. I testified before the territorial court. Silas served 2 years in the prison at Helena and was released last spring. He let that sit. Malcolm owed him money. Malcolm owed everyone money, which was Malcolm's defining characteristic. But Silas has a particular approach to collecting debts. He is patient, he is methodical, and he does not forget. And the three women, Abigail said, the ones who disappeared. The silence that followed had a specific texture to it, the texture of a room in which something true is about to be said out loud for the first time. It was Grace who said it. Malcolm was arranging them, placing advertisements through matrimonial agencies on the East Coast, corresponding with women who were desperate enough to come west on the strength of letters and delivering them to Silas upon arrival. She said it the way you say something you have been trying to prove for 2 years, with the flat, exhausted precision of someone for whom the statement is not a revelation, but a confirmation. We couldn't prove it. We can't prove it now. But Clara from Ohio and Mary from Illinois and Catherine from Chicago did not run away. They were taken, and they were taken because Malcolm sent for them. Abigail stood very still, and Malcolm sent for me. No one said anything for a moment. Then the door opened. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. This was not a physical phenomenon. The September morning outside was the same temperature it had been a moment before. But the man who walked into Grace's restaurant carried with him a quality of cold that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with what he was. He was tall, 60-something or somewhere on the far side of 50, that was moving toward it with the confidence of a man who has decided that age is a thing that happens to other people. His brown hair had gone steel at the temples in a way that suited him the way expensive things suit people who have spent their lives surrounded by them. His face would have been conventionally handsome if not for the quality in his eyes, which were the kind of pale blue that looks warm at first glance and turns cold the longer you look at it, like shallow water over a deep drop. He was wearing a suit, fine wool gray with a white shirt and a dark tie, which in a town where most men wore canvas and leather was a statement of a particular and deliberate kind. He moved with the ease of a man who has never in his adult life entered a room where he was not immediately the most powerful person in it. His gaze moved through the room the way a man surveys property he owns. "Grace," he said pleasantly, "I can smell bacon all the way from the street." "Kitchen's closed, Silas." He smiled. The smile was technically warm. It had learned to perform warmth the way an actor learns a role with sufficient skill that a stranger would be convinced. But Abigail was not a stranger to that particular performance. She had spent 14 months in proximity to James Hartford's version of it. For me, surely not. His gaze had already moved past Grace, past Lucas. It found Abigail the way you find something you have been expecting to find, with a kind of satisfaction that was far worse than surprise. The smile widened just fractionally. "Well, you must be Malcolm's girl. I'd heard you'd arrived." He took one step toward her, then another. Easy, unhurried, the movement of a man who has all the time in the world, because time and his experience arranges itself according to his preferences. "Silas Drummond, I was a business associate of Malcolm's. Terrible shame his sudden departure. Left a great many loose ends." He stopped at a distance that was one step closer than courtesy required. "You and I should talk, Miss Brennan, about Malcolm's obligations, about what that might mean for you." "She doesn't owe you anything," Lucas said. His voice was quiet, quieter than it had been all morning. The particular quiet of something that is not loud because it has no need to be. Silas turned to look at him with the expression of a man who has encountered a familiar obstruction. "Lucas Mercer, still appointing yourself keeper of other people's difficulties. How has that been working out for you?" He turned back to Abigail before Lucas could respond. "Malcolm was specific about you, Miss Brennan. Boston school teacher, educated. He said you were practical, that you understood the world as it is rather than as it ought to be." The pale eyes watched her with a patience that was its own kind of threat. "He used you as collateral against a loan. Said you'd be arriving. He said you would work to cover what he owed. Household services, he called it. Flexible term. He let the word flexible do what he intended it to do. I'm certain we can come to an arrangement. The words were a violation. The private correspondence she had written across 7 months, the careful presentation of herself that she had constructed in those letters, the vulnerability she had allowed herself in the assumption of privacy, all of it had been handed to this man as an inventory item. A description of an asset. She felt the heat rise in her face. Not embarrassment, something older and harder. I don't know what Malcolm told you, she said, but I am not bound by any agreement Malcolm made on my behalf. I did not agree to anything, and I certainly have no obligation to you. Oh, but you do, his voice remained pleasant. You see, when someone uses another person as collateral on a legitimate debt, the debt follows the collateral. That's simply how arrangements work, Miss Brennan. Nothing personal, it's orderly. Lucas stood up. The chair scraped back with a brain like a period at the end of a sentence. Get out, Silas. This is Grace's establishment. Then Grace can ask you to leave. I'm asking you first. For a long moment, the two men regarded each other across the small space of the restaurant, and Abigail could feel the years between them like a physical weight. The testimony, and the prison, and the graves on the hill, and every day of the 3 years since that had been building toward whatever this was. Silas broke the eye contact first. The smile never left. Enjoy your breakfast, Lucas. He adjusted his cufflinks with precise fingers. Miss Brennan, we'll talk again soon. I always collect what I'm owed. He tipped his hat to Grace with a courtesy that was itself a kind of contempt. A pleasure as always. He walked out and left the door open behind him. The silence that followed was the silence of a room in which something true has just made itself visible for the first time. Grace was the one who broke it. You shouldn't have done that. Someone had to. Now we know she matters to you. She doesn't matter to me. She is a woman who was dealt a bad hand. Grace made a sound that occupied the space between a laugh and something sadder. Keep telling yourself that. Abigail found her voice. It was steadier than she had expected. What did he mean? About collateral? About me working off a debt? Lucas sat back down. He had lost interest in his eggs. He looked at the plate for a moment as if reconsidering what kind of conversation he had walked into this morning when he came in for breakfast. Silas has been doing this for at least 2 years, he said finally, bringing women in through the matrimonial arrangement circuit, women who have no people here, no connections, no one who will come looking. He paused. He ships them north, mining camps in Canada, sells them as workers. Some know what they're getting into. Most don't. The room tilted slightly. Abigail gripped the counter's edge. The 3 women. Yes. And Malcolm sent for all 3 of them. That's my belief, and yours makes 4. He looked at her directly then, and what was in those gray eyes was not pity, which she could have tolerated, but something more unsettling. Something that looked like the beginning of being seen. That is why you need to leave today. I'll pay for the ticket. Just get out of Copper Bend before Silas decides to stop being cordial. Abigail looked at him. She looked at the offer he was making, which was a real offer made by someone who did not make offers lightly, and she understood that it came from somewhere genuine inside the careful architecture of a man who had built himself into a structure designed to keep the weather out. No, she said. He blinked. Not much, but enough. No, I didn't come to Montana to run. Boston is not an option. Nowhere east is an option. I came because I had nowhere else to go, and a woman who has nowhere else to go is not the same as a woman who has nowhere at all. She straightened, and the ribs protested, and she ignored them. So I'm staying. And if Silas Drummond thinks he can walk into a room and describe me as an inventory item, he's going to find out what a Boston schoolteacher looks like when she's had enough. Lucas studied her for a long, measuring moment. You're stubborn, he said. I'm practical. There's a difference. She picked up the coffee pot and refilled his cup because she worked here and he was a customer, and that was the situation. You know this town, you know Silas. Help me understand what happened to those 3 women. Maybe if we understand what he's doing, we can stop it from happening again. There's no we here, Miss Brennan. I'm a rancher. You're a woman who stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. Then why are you still sitting at this counter? He did not have an answer for that. Or if he did, it was not one he was prepared to share in daylight in public, with the memory of Silas Drummond's visit still cooling in the air of the room. He stood, put money on the counter for the breakfast he had not finished. "Stay out of trouble," he said, moving toward the door. "I'll do my best," Abigail said to his back. He paused at the door, did not turn. "Your best may not be good enough in this town." A beat of silence. "But it's more than most people bring." Then he was gone, and the morning light came through the door he left open, and Grace came out of the kitchen with her hands on her apron and looked at the empty doorway and then at Abigail. "Well," she said. "Well," Abigail agreed. "He came back in here 3 days in a row after each of the other girls arrived. Watched them from that seat. Never spoke to them. Never offered anything." Grace began clearing the counter with calm, economical movements. "You're the first one he's talked to." Abigail thought about that for a moment. "Is that significant?" Grace considered the question with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "It might be the most significant thing that's happened in this town since Lucas Mercer sat in that witness chair and told a territorial court what he saw Silas Drummond do to a man who owed him money." She carried the cups back to the kitchen. Abigail stood in the quiet of the restaurant and looked out the front window at the main street of Copper Bend, at the mountains beyond the rooftops, already carrying their first suggestion of snow at the Silver Dollar Saloon with its curtains drawn against the morning. 3 women, 3 names she did not yet know but was going to learn, and a fourth name her own that had been written into a ledger by a man who had decided that women were a category of asset rather than a category of person, and who had been operating in this town in plain sight for at least 2 years, while people looked elsewhere or looked down or looked at the bottom of the glass that Silas kept filling for the sheriff at the Silver Dollar every single night. She thought about the journal. Something about Malcolm's hasty departure suggested that he had not taken everything with him, that a man in a hurry to avoid being killed leaves things behind, and that among those things there might be something worth finding. She thought about the room above the general store where Malcolm had lived. She thought about what 3 days meant. Then she went back to the kitchen and finished the dishes because she worked here and there was work to do, and she had learned over the preceding year that the best thinking happened when the hands were busy. The clock was running. She just did not know yet how loud it was ticking. The days in Copper Bend had a rhythm to them that Abigail learned the way you learn the layout of an unfamiliar house in the dark, by moving carefully, by paying attention to where the furniture was, by accepting that you would knock into things before you understood the shape of the space. She rose before dawn. She dressed in the dark because the lamp oil cost money, and she was spending carefully accounting for every cent the way a person accounts for water in desert country, not with anxiety, but with respect for scarcity. She walked the half block from the church to Grace's restaurant, with the mountains above her still black against the pre-dawn sky, and the first birds beginning their argument with the silence. Grace was always already there. This was a fact of the universe, as reliable as the cold and the altitude, and Abigail found she was grateful for it in a way that went beyond the practical. There was something about a person who was simply consistently already present that the bones recognized as safety before the mind caught up. The work was honest, dishwater and coffee grounds, and the particular satisfaction of a clean surface after a dirty one. The customers came in waves early, miners heading to claims in the hills, then ranchers, then the shopkeepers and clerks who kept the small commerce of the town moving. She learned their faces before she learned their names, and she watched them the way she had always watched rooms. She was new to gathering information about the social architecture, who deferred to whom, who avoided eye contact when certain subjects came up, who sat with their back to the wall. Copper Bend was a town under pressure that had learned not to show it. She could feel it in the way conversations died at certain turns, the way the sheriff, a broad-faced man named Tully who drank 3 cups of coffee every morning without speaking to anyone, kept his eyes fixed on his cup when Grace was within earshot. The way the banker, a thin, anxious man named Caldwell, arrived precisely at 7:15 every morning and left precisely at 7:22, never varying, never lingering, as if the restaurant were a place he needed to visit but could not afford to be seen comfortable in. They were all afraid of something. She was becoming increasingly certain she knew what it was. On the second morning, Lucas came in again. He took the same seat at the counter. He ordered the same breakfast. He looked out the same window at the same street. The pattern of him had a quality of ritual to it that spoke of a man who had organized his life around repetition as a substitute for meaning, who had replaced the texture of ordinary living with the smooth, featureless surface of routine. Abigail brought his coffee. Mr. Mercer, Miss Brennan, a pause that stretched for a moment longer than either of them filled. Your right shoulder, she said. You keep it lower than the left. Old wound or recent? He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. Old, he said. Horse threw me 3 years back. Healed a little crooked. I know something about ribs that healed crooked, she said without elaboration, and refilled his coffee and went back to work. She did not see the way he looked at her retreating back, but Grace, who saw everything, did. On the second afternoon, sitting in her room behind the church while the light failed over the cemetery, Abigail wrote in her own journal. Not the careful, composed letters she had written to Malcolm, those exercises in self-presentation, but the real record, the one she kept for no audience. 3 women, Clara, Mary, Catherine, names without faces, arrived in this town the same way I arrived. Left no way I can yet identify. Malcolm's room is above the general store. The store is run by a man named Hendricks who works for Silas and appears to believe that if he looks only at what is directly in front of him, the things to either side cannot be said to exist. There are papers in that room. I am certain of it. A man running Malcolm's kind of operation does not do it without records. Perhaps because the debts require documentation. Perhaps because men like Malcolm need to feel they are conducting business rather than committing crimes, and business requires paperwork. I need to get into that room. Grace has a key. She stopped writing and sat with that thought for a long time while the cemetery went dark below the window and the coyotes began their nightly consultations somewhere in the hills. It was the third morning when she saw it clearly. Lucas came in, same seat, same order, same ritual stillness. But this time, as Abigail carried his plate out, she saw something she had not seen before or had seen and not understood. He was watching the door, not with the unfocused awareness of a man in the habit of facing exits, though he had that too, with specific directed attention. Every time the door opened, his posture shifted by a fraction that would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it, a micro-tensing along the jaw, a subtle weight transfer toward his right hand. He was waiting for Silas to walk back through that door. He had been waiting for it since the morning Silas had come in and made his declaration, and Lucas had stood up and Silas had left, smiling. Abigail set the plate in front of him. She kept her voice conversational. You testified against him 5 years ago. Yes. And you believe he arranged the raid that killed your wife and daughter. The air and the space between them changed. I have believed that, Lucas said very carefully, for 3 years. And you cannot prove it. No. So you are sitting here every morning by watching that door and waiting for him to make a move you can respond to while he moves at his own pace and on his own timeline because he is patient and methodical and not afraid of you, and the 3 women who disappeared are still gone and the 4th has arrived. He looked at her. You're describing my situation accurately, he said. Yes. Then we have more in common than you want to admit. She put the coffee pot down and stood straight, accounting for the ribs. Because I have been sitting in that kitchen, watching the same door, waiting to understand what I walked into. And waiting is not a plan, it is just time passing while someone else acts. He held her gaze for a long, measuring moment. The gray of his eyes in the morning light was less cold than she had initially cataloged it, or perhaps it was the same cold with something else present. Underneath it now, something that was not warmth exactly, but was the precondition of warmth, the cleared ground. What do you think we should do, he said. Not a concession, not quite, but the question itself was a thing. I think Abigail said that Malcolm's room has something in it worth finding. I think Grace knows how to get in. And I think that whatever is up there is the thing Silas burned the store for eventually when he decides he needs to clean things up. A beat of silence. How long have you been thinking this? Since the first afternoon. She picked up the coffee pot and moved to the next customer. Over her shoulder, finish your eggs, Mr. Mercer. You look like you haven't been eating properly. Grace at the kitchen doorway watched this exchange with the expression of a person who has been waiting a considerable time for a particular thing to happen and is now allowing herself a carefully measured moment of satisfaction. That evening, Abigail asked Grace about the key. They were alone in the restaurant, the last customer long gone, the chairs up on the tables and the floor swept. Grace was counting the day's receipts at the back table with the focused competence she brought to everything. "Malcolm's room," Abigail said. "You have a key." Grace did not look up from the receipts. "He gave it to me when he first rented the room. For emergencies," he said. "This is an emergency." The law would not agree with that characterization. The law drinks at Silas's saloon every evening and has been persuaded not to notice 3 women disappearing. I'm not especially concerned with the law's characterization. Grace looked up then. She studied Abigail with those sharp, seeing eyes for a long moment. "Midnight," she said finally. "Come to the back door of the store. Wear something dark." "Everything I own is dark. Boston fashion." The corner of Grace's mouth moved. That might be the first useful thing Boston has contributed to this situation. The day between that conversation and midnight was the longest Abigail had spent since the train west. She washed dishes. She served coffee. She listened to the rhythms of the town with the careful attention she had been developing, noting which men came in at what hours, which ones lingered, which ones looked toward the silver dollar when they thought no one was watching. Around noon, Lucas came in for the second time that day, which was not his usual pattern. He sat at the counter and did not order anything. He looked at the window for a moment and then at Abigail. "I've been thinking about what you said this morning." "I said several things this morning. About waiting not being a plan." She set a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. And I've been waiting for 3 years." He wrapped his hands around the cup. They were a working man's hands, heavy-knuckled, marked by rope and leather and cold. "I came home from a 3-day hunt and found 2 graves and a ranch that was ash, and I decided that the way forward was to wait until I had enough to act on." He looked at the coffee. "I have been waiting so long that waiting became the thing itself, the point, not the preparation." Abigail said nothing. She understood that this was not the kind of statement that benefited from response. It was the kind that needed room. "Grace told you about Anna and Lily," he said finally. "Yes." "She shouldn't have. She thought I needed to understand why you were telling me to run. She was right that I needed to understand it." Abigail paused. "I'm sorry about your family." "Everyone is sorry." The words were not harsh. They were just worn smooth by use. "It doesn't change anything." "No, but maybe it doesn't have to change anything to matter." He looked at her, then directly with the full weight of those gray eyes, and she had the distinct impression that he was seeing her the way he had not quite managed to see her before, past the bruise and the 9 cents and the category of woman in difficulty into whatever was underneath. "What happened to you," he said, "in Boston, before you came?" She had not expected the directness of it. She had expected the avoidance, the careful circumlocution of a man who does not want to ask a question whose answer he might have to do something about. "My father died when I was 19, she said. "My mother was ill. I took a position teaching at a school in Boston and managed until a man named James Hartford decided he wanted to marry me, and I let myself believe that was a good idea, and it was not." She kept her voice even. Not because the events were not what they were, but because she had found that a steady voice was the only kind worth using for certain truths. "When I decided the arrangement was not one I could continue, he made the consequences of that decision clear. Then I got on a train." Lucas was quiet for a long time. "The ribs," he said. 3 of them. They healed badly. Doc Morrison in town says there's not much to be done about it now." His jaw tightened, very slightly, the kind of tight that happens below the level of decision. "If James Hartford ever comes west," he said, "I'd appreciate you letting me know. So you can do what I'm explain to him how men are supposed to treat women." A pause. "The explanation would be thorough." The coldness in his voice suggested the explanation would involve considerably more than words. And for the first time in a very long time, Abigail allowed herself the small, complicated comfort of being angry about what had happened to her in the presence of someone whose anger about it matched her own. She refilled his coffee. "Midnight," she said quietly. "Grace and I are going into Malcolm's room. You should know in case things go wrong." He looked at her. "I'll be there," he said. 3 blocks away, in the back office of the Silver Dollar Saloon, Silas Drummond sat at his desk in the amber light of a good lamp and worked through the papers in front of him with the patient attention of a man conducting genuine business. Because that was what it was to him. Genuine business, supply and demand, a market that existed because it had always existed in various forms, under various arrangements, with various justifications. He was not a man who troubled himself with the moral architecture of his operations. That was for people who could not see clearly. He opened the ledger to a fresh page. At the top, in his careful handwriting, Abigail Brennan, Boston, Massachusetts, arrived September 14, 1876. Below that, a notation, Malcolm's account, $340 outstanding. Brennan offered as partial settlement. Assessment pending. Below that, complications, Lucas Mercer, actively monitoring. He tapped his pen against the ledger for a moment. Lucas Mercer was a problem that had been running alongside his operations for 3 years, like a stone in a boot, not disabling, not preventing forward motion, but a constant irritant, a reminder of a debt that had not been properly settled. The testimony. The 2 years in Helena, the way Mercer had come back from that hunt to find his ranch in Ash, and had somehow decided in the absence of proof that Silas was responsible. Silas had not arranged the Comanche raid. This was a fact, not a defense, simply a fact. The raid had been what it was, chance, random, the violence of a contested frontier that had nothing to do with him. He had been in prison when it happened. He had learned about it through the prison grapevine and had felt something that was not quite satisfaction, but occupied some of the same space, the impersonal recognition that the universe occasionally arranged things with a neatness that served his interests. He had not touched Lucas Mercer's family, but he intended to let Lucas Mercer spend the rest of his life believing he had, because a man who believes he is facing a monster is less dangerous than a man who knows he is facing a businessman. The believer acts from emotion. The businessman acts from calculation. He wrote one more line in the ledger. Note, 3 days remaining before the next southbound coach. Resolve before departure or accept complications. He capped the pen, stood, walked to the window. On the street below, the main street of his town moved through its evening patterns. The silver dollar did good business. The bank would open tomorrow under his director's supervision. The land deeds in his safe represented 47% of the productive acreage within 20 miles. He was a patient man. 3 days was sufficient time. The night had gone fully cold by the time Abigail slipped out of the room behind the church. September in the mountains after dark had an edge to it that belonged to a season further along, a preview of what was coming, and she was grateful for the wool coat Grace had lent her, which had belonged to Grace's late husband and was several sizes too large, but was warm in the way of things made for Montana winters. The main street was empty. The silver dollar's light showed behind its curtains. A dog somewhere on the far side of town conducted a brief, inconclusive negotiation with the dark. Somewhere above the ridgeline, invisible behind the clouds that had come in from the northwest, the moon was present but not useful. Grace was at the back door of the general store, promised a small lantern in her hand, with the wick turned so low it provided just enough light to prevent collision with furniture, and nothing more. She wore dark clothing and the expression of a woman who has been planning this particular operation for longer than she is prepared to admit. Malcolm gave you the key, Abigail said, not a question. He thought it was a gesture of trust. Grace unlocked the door. It was a gesture of carelessness. The staircase was narrow and dark and smelled of old wood and the particular mustiness of a building that takes in weather at the joints. Grace led the way with the lantern close against her body, minimizing the light that reached the windows. The door to Malcolm's room was unlocked. This detail registered as significant. Malcolm had left in a hurry. 3 nights ago before dawn without telling anyone. A man leaving in that kind of hurry does not stop to lock his door. He takes what he can carry and he goes, and what he leaves behind is an accidental record of who he was and what he was doing. The room had been searched. Not thoroughly, not with the careful attention of someone who knew what they were looking for, but roughly with the impatience of someone looking for something specific and not finding it, drawers pulled out and not replaced, papers scattered from the desk across the floor, a coat thrown into the corner. Wade's men, Abigail thought. They had been here before her. But they had not found what she was looking for, because men like Wade's men look for obvious things, money documents that are labeled as important objects that announce their own value. They do not think to look at the bottom of the last drawer, under the false panel, that a careful person might put there, the kind of careful that came not from sophistication but from paranoia. She went to the desk. Most of what was there was the ordinary debris of a failing business. Bills from suppliers, letters from creditors, several of them in escalating tones that tracked a familiar narrative of optimism collapsing toward desperation. A ledger for the store that showed margins so thin they barely existed. She moved through it systematically. Behind her, Grace held the lantern and watched the door, the bottom drawer. She pulled it fully out, set it aside, reached into the empty space. Her fingers found the leather. The journal was small, battered at the corners, the kind of thing you could carry in a coat pocket. She opened it carefully. Malcolm Pritchard's handwriting was small and cramped, the handwriting of a man who had learned it under duress and had never made peace with the effort. The entries were dated going back 2 years. She went to the most recent pages first. September 10th, 1876. S is demanding payment. I need more time. Told him about the girl from Boston. He is considering. September 12th, 1876. S agreed to an extension. Says the Boston girl will cover part of the outstanding amount if she is suitable. He asked for a photograph. I sent the one from her second letter. September 15th, 1876. S has approved. Says she will do. She is to be directed to the Silver Dollar upon arrival. Standard arrangement. Standard arrangement. 2 words. Abigail read them twice. Then she held very still for a moment with the journal open in her hands and let the full weight of the phrase do what it needed to do. Standard arrangement, not a one-time improvisation, not a desperate measure. A system, a process that had been used enough times to have a name, a protocol, a shorthand. She flipped back, further, looking for the other names. She found them. March 4th, 1875. Clara Whitmore, Ohio, arrived as arranged. Transfer to S, completed March 21st. Outstanding balance reduced by $80. September 14th, 1875. Mary Callahan, Illinois, arrived. Transfer September 28th. Balance reduced by $95. February 3rd, 1876. Catherine Marsh, Illinois. Arranged through W. Prescott rather than standard channel. Delayed. DBE reports complications. Resolution expected by end of week. W. Prescott. Wade Prescott. Grace, Abigail said quietly. Grace came to her side and read over her shoulder. She read slowly with the deliberate attention of someone whose reading was harder won than Abigail's, and her face as she read went through several expressions that settled finally into something hard and clear, and utterly without surprise. This is what I've needed for 2 years, she said. Her voice was very steady. 2 years of watching and noting and not being able to prove it. There's more. Abigail turned the pages. The names continued. Clara Mary Catherine and 3 more. Elizabeth Hayes, Maria Santos, and then dated 2 weeks before Malcolm's disappearance, August 30th, 1876. Sarah Drummond. Note, not a standard arrangement. S's instruction, resolution requested, no payment indicated, entry marked resolved. Grace went completely still. Drummond, she said, his niece was. Abigail looked at the entry again. The entry doesn't show payment, it shows resolution. That's different from the other entries. Because Sarah wasn't sold. Grace's voice had gone quiet in a way that meant something specific. She was removed. There's a difference. A pause. Reverend Whitfield told me 6 weeks ago that a young girl had come to him, 17 years old, said her uncle was trying to force her into something she wouldn't name. She wouldn't stay because she was afraid of what he'd do to anyone who helped her. Grace stopped, and then she was gone. The silence that followed was the silence of a room in which horror has been confirmed rather than introduced. 6 women, Abigail said, 6 names in this book, and Sarah is different from the others. Sarah was someone who knew something, or who refused to cooperate, and Silas made her disappear without even making it look like a standard arrangement. She was about to say something more when the sound reached them. Boots on the stairs, not one set, multiple, heavy, not attempting quiet. Grace blew out the lantern. The room plunged into a darkness so complete it had texture. Abigail closed the journal and pressed it against her body, tucking it inside her coat against her ribs. The broken ones and the pain of it was sharp enough that she had to breathe through it deliberately. The window. Too high to jump without breaking something that was already broken. The door, the only other option, which would mean walking directly into whoever was coming. Grace moved to the side of the door in the dark, and Abigail heard rather than saw her pick up something heavy from the shelf, the candlestick she had noted when they came in, heavy brass substantial enough. The door opened. A figure stepped through, moving carefully, a lantern raised. Lucas Mercer, followed immediately by the thin white shape of Reverend Whitfield, slightly breathless from the stairs. Both men stopped when they saw the women standing in the darkness. "What in God's name?" Lucas began. "Keep your voice down," Grace said with the authority of someone who had been keeping their voice down and being ignored about it for too long. "What are you doing here?" "The same thing you are, I suspect." Lucas held the lantern up and looked around the room at the scattered papers at the open drawers. "I've been watching this building for 2 days waiting for an opportunity to get in." He looked at Abigail. "You got here first." "I had a key." "So I see." His eyes moved to the shape inside her coat. "You found something." She pulled the journal out and held it. Even in the dim lantern light, she could see his expression change as he understood what he was looking at. "Malcolm's records," she said. 2 years of them, every name, every payment, every transfer. She opened to the last entry, and this. He took the journal, held it to the lantern, read. The stillness that came over him as he read was different from the ordinary stillness she had cataloged in him, the controlled quiet of a man keeping things managed. This was the stillness of a man discovering something that rearranges the load-bearing structure of what he believed. Reverend Whitfield, who had been waiting, spoke into the silence. "Sarah Drummond came to me 6 weeks ago," he said. "She was frightened in a way I had never seen from that girl, and I had known her since she was 3 years old. She said her uncle was trying to make her do something. She wouldn't tell me what. I tried to find a way to get her safely out of town." His good eye was very clear and very old in the lantern light. Then she was gone, and Silas told anyone who asked that she had run away to relatives in Denver. "She has no relatives in Denver," Grace said. "I checked." Lucas looked up from the journal. The weather behind his eyes had become something specific, something with direction and force. "This is evidence," he said. "Real evidence. We take this to the territorial marshal." "Carson is 300 miles away," Grace said. "And by the time he gets here, this journal will have had an accident. We will have had accidents." "Then what?" "Then we find out where these women went, if any of them are still alive. If we can get testimony from even one of them combined with this journal, we might have enough to bring Silas down permanently." Grace looked at each of them in turn. "The journal mentions Black Creek. Every transfer notation ends with that location. Does anyone know it?" Lucas and Reverend Whitfield exchanged a look. "Old mining camp," Lucas said. "About 40 miles north. Played out 5 years ago. Should be abandoned." A pause. "I've seen smoke from that direction. Heard things. Never had reason to investigate." "We have reason now," Abigail said. "It's a 2-day ride through rough country, even without considering that Silas may have men guarding it. I'm aware of the difficulties." "You're not going." "I'm the only one here with nothing to lose." She met his eyes and held them. "Grace has her restaurant. You have your ranch. Reverend Whitfield has his church. I arrived 4 days ago with 9 cents. If this goes wrong for me, the loss is mine to bear. But those women, if any of them are still alive, they have been there for months, and they need someone to come." Lucas looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man trying to solve a problem that does not have a neat solution. "You are," he said, "the most stubborn person I have encountered in 3 years." "I'm practical," she said. "There's still a difference." What he said next was lost to the sound that reached them from below. Heavier boots, multiple sets, not careful, not attempting quiet at all. The sound of men who already know they have the advantage. Grace moved to the window. Lucas moved toward Abigail, positioning himself between her and the door, with the instinct of a man for whom this positioning is so deeply practiced it requires no thought. The door burst open. Wade Prescott stood in the doorway. The revolver in his hand caught the lantern light and turned silver. Behind him, 2 men blocked the staircase, both armed, the larger one with a scar across his throat, the other missing 2 fingers on his left hand. Wade's smile was slow and satisfied, the smile of a man arriving at a scene he has been anticipating. "Well, well," he said, looking at each of them in turn, taking his time with it. Looks like we've got ourselves a situation. His eyes moved to the journal in Abigail's hands. I'll take that, he said pleasantly, and then maybe we can all discuss what happens next. He stepped fully into the room. The lantern threw shadows up the walls that shifted as he moved, and in that moment of shifting shadow, every person in that room made a calculation, and every calculation came out the same way. There were 3 guns and 2 exits and 6 people, and whatever happened in the next 60 seconds was going to matter for a very long time. Lucas moved first. The gunshot in the confined space of Malcolm's room was a sound that made all other sounds temporarily irrelevant. The percussion of it hit the walls and came back at them from every direction simultaneously, and in the ring of silence that followed, 2 things were true at once. Wade's hat was gone, a neat hole punched through the crown where Lucas's bullet had passed within an inch of ending everything. And Lucas was down on one knee, his left hand pressed to his shoulder blood, coming through his fingers with the dark, purposeful flow of something serious. Reverend Whitfield moved with a speed that was startling in a man of his age in construction, the chair catching the armed man's gun arm with a crack that was probably the sound of something breaking. The revolver discharged into the ceiling, and the plaster came down in a white shower. Grace hit the second man with the brass candlestick. Once. The sound was definitive, and Abigail ran, not from cowardice, from calculation. The journal was the thing that mattered. The journal was the reason all of this was happening, the reason these men were here, the reason Wade Prescott had come up those stairs with 3 guns, and the confidence of a man on an errand that he expected to be simple. She ran with it pressed against her broken ribs, and the pain of that was extraordinary. And she ran through it the way she had run through everything else in the past several months, because stopping was not an option, and had not been an option for long enough that the calculation happened below the level of conscious thought. Past Wade, who was tracking 2 threats at once and could not track 3. Down the stairs in the dark, her hand on the wall because the lantern was behind her and there was no light down, and through the back door into the alley. The night air hit her like cold water. Behind her, the sounds of the room above. More shots, a man's cry of pain high and sharp. Then Reverend Whitfield's voice clear and deliberate above the noise. Grace, the window. Go. Then silence. Then the crash of something heavy falling. Then footsteps on the stairs. Fast. The man with the missing finger blood running dark from the side of his head where the candlestick had found him, his face carrying the specific expression of a man who has been embarrassed and is going to do something about it. Abigail ran. She cut left between buildings into the narrow gap where the moonlight did not reach her hands, scraping against the rough wood as she navigated by touch. Her lungs were burning. The ribs were beyond complaint, now operating in the register of plain white agony, and she ran through it because she ran through everything. The hand closed around her ankle. She went down hard, the journal flying from her grip, the impact taking the breath from her in a single violent compression. The man was on her before she could recover, his weight pinning her one hand, finding her throat in the dark and beginning to close. Her vision went bright around the edges. Not stars, something more immediate. She clawed at his forearm with both hands, and the grip tightened, and she thought in a clarity that felt insulting given the circumstances that she had not survived Boston and the train west and James Hartford and 9 cents and 4 days of Copper Bend to die in an alley at the hands of a man whose name she did not know. Then the weight was gone. Lucas had him by the collar, hauling him off with his right arm, his wounded left pressed against his body, the blood dark on his shirt, in the narrow strip of moonlight that reached into the alley. He threw the man against the wall with enough force that something in the impact cracked either the wall or the man. The man tried to raise his gun. Lucas kicked it from his hand, then drove his fist into the man's face. Once, a second time, a third, methodical, without particular anger. The way a man does something that needs doing and sees no benefit in doing it inefficiently. The man stopped moving. Lucas turned. His face was gray with blood loss and effort. Are you hurt? Abigail was sitting up, both hands on the ground, breathing carefully around the ribs that were now operating in a register she did not have language for. She shook her head. Can you run? She nodded. He picked up the journal from where it had fallen and pressed it back into her hands. His grip on her fingers was brief and firm and entirely deliberate. My ranch, 12 miles south. Follow the river. Don't stop. You're bleeding. I've been worse. That is not the reassurance you think it is. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile. The place a smile might be if the circumstances were different. Reverend Whitfield, he said. He stayed to cover Grace's exit through the window. He took a bullet. His jaw was tight. He took a bullet. I couldn't get back to him. Grace got him out through the window. I don't know if he made it. The words landed. Abigail absorbed them the way you absorb a blow you were not braced for, with the full weight of them, no deflection available. Is Grace out through the window? She's ahead of you. He looked back toward the main street where voices were rising, the sounds of men responding to gunfire. Go, now. Take the journal to the marshal if I don't arrive by dawn. His name is Carson. Tell him everything. Lucas, go, and she went. She ran through the edge of town and out into the open country with the Montana night enormous around her and the mountains black against the stars. The river was a silver line in the darkness, and she followed it south, running, when the ribs allowed it, walking, when they did not, always moving, because stopping meant dying, and she had been clear about that. Behind her, Copper Bend lit up like a nightmare. Torches and lanterns blooming against the dark, men organizing horses, the sounds of a search beginning. She had perhaps an hour's head start, perhaps less. The miles passed the way hard things pass, not quickly, not cleanly, but with the grinding accumulation of endurance. Her legs went numb somewhere around mile 3. Her vision started suggesting shapes in the dark that were not there around mile 5. She fell twice, got up both times because that was what she did now, because getting up had become the only available response to going down, a reflex so established it no longer required a decision. At mile 8, she heard hoofbeats behind her. Multiple horses. She left the river and climbed a small rise to a cluster of boulders and pressed herself between two of them, pulling her dark coat around her legs, breathing through her mouth in shallow pulls that were all the ribs would permit. 3 riders passed below her position, moving fast, following the river exactly as she had been. In the lead, even in the dark, she recognized the shape of Wade Prescott. They rode south, toward the ranch. She waited until the sound faded, then came down from the rocks and went cross-country, using the stars to navigate slower and harder, but away from the obvious path. Dawn was breaking the sky behind the eastern mountains, going from black to deep blue to the first thin wash of gold when she saw the ranch house ahead of her. Small and solid smoke from the chimney, a barn, and a corral. Lucas's horse at the hitching post. He had made it. The door opened before she could knock. Lucas stood there, left arm in a makeshift sling, fresh bandages, visible, his face the color of old ash, but his eyes sharp in a way that told her he had not slept and was not planning to. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him. They were both standing in the remains of a night that had taken more than either of them had planned for. You made good time, he said. Wade and 2 others are coming, she said. They followed the river, maybe 30 minutes behind me. He nodded, as if this was the information he had been waiting for rather than news. Get inside, he said. We're not running anymore. She stepped through the door into the warmth of the small house, and behind her the Montana dawn was coming up cold and clear and entirely indifferent to what was about to happen. But the journal was safe against her ribs. The evidence was intact, and 30 minutes was enough time, if you used it correctly, to prepare for the kind of reckoning that had been 3 years in the making. The ranch house was the kind of place that tells you everything about the person who built it if you know how to read the language of objects and arrangement. Abigail stood inside the door and read it in the 30 seconds she had before Lucas began pulling weapons from the cabinet against the far wall. 3 rooms total. The main room with its fireplace and 2 chairs and a table that could seat 4 if the occasion required it. A kitchen that opened off the back. A closed door to the right that she understood without being told was the bedroom, the one that had not been properly inhabited in 3 years. The furniture was simple and good, made by someone with patience and an understanding of what lasts. Nothing had been replaced or updated or adjusted since the day it was placed. The room had the quality of a space that has been maintained rather than lived in, kept clean and intact against the possibility of a life returning to it that had not yet returned. On the shelf above the fireplace, a child's wooden horse, painted red once the paint worn to bare wood on the curved back where small hands had held it. On the chair nearest to the fire, draped over the arm, with the careful placement of something preserved rather than forgotten, a woman's shawl. Blue wool, faded but intact, the kind of shawl a woman puts on in the evening when the mountain cold comes through the walls. Abigail looked at these things for exactly as long as she could afford to look at them. Then she turned to the problem at hand. Lucas was moving through the room with the efficiency of a man who has been preparing for a specific kind of situation for long enough that the preparation is automatic. Two rifles from the cabinet, another revolver. The shotgun he handed to Abigail with the straightforward directness of someone who does not have time for the social negotiation of whether to offer it. Simple, he said. Point at what you need to stop. Pull the trigger. The kick will knock you back, so brace your feet. 2 shots before you need to reload. She took the weapon. It was heavier than she had imagined. Cold metal and polished wood, the weight of something that has been made for a single purpose and carries that purpose in every ounce of its construction. She held it the way he showed her, settled the stock against her shoulder, above the broken ribs, because against the ribs was not an option. They'll try to burn us out, Lucas said, checking the loads on both rifles with movements so practiced they required no visual attention. Fire is Wade's preference when the direct approach has not resolved things. He used it at Fort Laramie the same way. You know him well. I knew him. 7 years ago at Fort Laramie, Wade Prescott was a sergeant in my unit. He deserted during a Sioux engagement, took the supply wagon, left his unit to manage without adequate ammunition. A pause. He set the first rifle down and picked up the second. 3 men in my unit died because of what he took and when he took it. I filed the report. He was branded a deserter. He set the second rifle against the window frame. He never forgave me for filing it. And now he works for Silas. Men like Wade find men like Silas. It is a natural arrangement. Wade provides capability without conscience. Silas provides the protection of money and influence. They are useful to each other in ways that ordinary people cannot easily dismantle. He moved to the window facing north, the direction the riders would come from, and positioned himself to one side of it, keeping himself out of the direct line of the glass. There is a root cellar under the kitchen, he said. If things go badly, get in it. When it is over, however it ends, take the journal to Helena. Marshall Carson. Tell him everything. I already told you I'm not hiding while you fight. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to survive. Those are related but not identical. She moved to the window on the other side of the room, the one that gave a view of the approach from the east. The dawn light was strengthening now, the mountains going from blue-black to the first warm suggestion of gold along their ridgelines. Beautiful, she thought, in the way that beautiful things have of being entirely indifferent to what is happening at their feet. When I was washing dishes in Grace's restaurant, she said, keeping her voice conversational, keeping it even because the steadiness of her voice was one of the tools she had, and she intended to use it, I thought about those 3 women, Clara, Mary, Catherine. I thought about what it meant that they came west the same way I did, made the same calculations I made, decided the same way I decided that the risk of going was smaller than the risk of staying. Yes. And then I thought about what it means that no one came for them. That 3 women could vanish from a Montana town, and the sheriff looked into his coffee cup, and the bank kept opening, and the silver dollar kept doing business, and everyone understood that looking too closely was bad for your health. Lucas was watching the northern road. Yes, he said again. I am not going to be the 4th woman who arrived and was handled and disappeared while the town looked elsewhere. She adjusted her grip on the shotgun. Whatever happens today, Silas Drummond is going to be brought to account for those women. That is the only outcome I am prepared to accept. He was quiet for a moment. Anna, he said finally without turning from the window. My wife. She was 26 when I married her. She had come west from Tennessee with her family when she was 12 and had spent 14 years becoming the most capable person I have ever known. She could shoe a horse, deliver a calf, negotiate with a crow trading party, and teach a child to read in approximately the same afternoon without finding any of it particularly remarkable. A pause. She would have liked you. She did not tolerate nonsense from anyone, including me, especially me. Abigail said nothing. She understood that this was a gift being offered carefully by a man who had not offered anything of himself to anyone in 3 years, and that the correct response was to receive it without making it larger or smaller than it was. And Lily, he continued, she was 5. She wanted to be a rancher. Not a rancher's wife. A rancher. She used to follow me around the yard telling me what I was doing wrong with the fencing. The ghost of something moved through his voice and was controlled before it became anything he could not control. She would have asked you 40 questions before you finished your first cup of coffee. She had her mother's instinct for people. She sounds remarkable. She was. A beat of silence. They both were. Outside, a bird called once from somewhere in the pines at the edge of the property. Then nothing. Then the sound of hooves. They came as the sun cleared the mountains. 3 riders pushing their horses hard up the southern road, then pulling up at 200 yards just outside the range where accurate rifle fire became reliable. Smart. Wade had always been smart about staying alive. It was the primary skill that had sustained him through every situation his choices had created. He stopped in the center of the road and looked at the ranch house for a moment with the unhurried attention of a man reading a situation before committing to a response. Then he called out, "Lucas?" His voice carried easily in the still morning air. "This doesn't have to end badly. Send out the girl and the journal, and you go back to your ranch and your grief, and we go back to our business. You have my word." Lucas tracked him through the rifle sights and said nothing. "Your word," he said finally low enough that only Abigail could hear it. "Worth approximately what it was at Fort Laramie." Wade seemed to understand that the direct appeal was not going to produce results. He conferred with his 2 men in a brief exchange of gestures pointing toward the barn on the left side of the property and the eastern approach to the house on the right. They dismounted. "He's splitting them," Abigail said. "Yes, one toward the barn, one to flank east. Wade comes directly." Lucas adjusted his position at the window. "He wants us watching 2 directions while he comes up the middle." "What do we do?" "We wait. Let him come to us. The house is more defensible than any position they can take outside it." A pause. "And we watch the barn." The first shot came from the man moving left, a crack of sound that punched through the window frame 6 inches above Lucas's head and sent a shower of splinters across the room. Lucas returned fire without apparent haste, a single shot, and the man went down clutching his leg with a sound that crossed the distance between them with uncomfortable clarity. The flanking man had reached the barn wall and was using it as cover, and from there he began firing at the eastern window where Abigail stood, the shots coming in a pattern that was designed to keep her from returning fire rather than to hit her suppression rather than elimination, which meant he was waiting for something. Wade had not moved. He was standing behind a fence post at 150 yards watching the patience of a man who was not the one taking fire. "He's waiting for the smoke," Lucas said. It arrived on the word. From the back of the barn, the first pale curl of it, thin and hesitant, at first, then thicker. Then the color changed from white to gray to the dark rolling black that meant the dry wood had caught properly. Inside the barn, the horses began to scream. That sound, high and wild and carrying the specific frequency of animal terror that the human nervous system is apparently constructed to respond to regardless of circumstance, went through Abigail like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. "How many horses?" she said. "3." His voice was flat. "Abigail, don't." She was already moving toward the back door. "He wants you to choose," Lucas said louder now. "That's the point. He wants you to feel it. Don't let him." She threw the back door open and ran toward the burning barn with a bucket of water from beside the kitchen pump, because it was the only thing in her hands, and a bucket of water was something and nothing was not an option. The heat met her 20 feet from the barn wall, a physical wall of it pushing back against her forward motion like a disagreement made manifest. She soaked her shawl in the bucket and wrapped it around her face and pushed through the barn door. The smoke was immediate and total, darkness made of particles rather than absence of light, and she navigated by sound. 2 horses in the first stall screaming, throwing themselves against the wood. She found the first latch by feel, burned her hand on the metal, got it open. The horse came through the doorway with the full weight of its panic, and she pressed herself against the stall wall and let it go because stopping it was not possible and not necessary. The second latch, easier, the metal not yet as hot. The horse bolted. The third stall was in the corner where the fire had started, and the heat there was a different thing entirely, a presence rather than a condition, something with intent. The horse inside had stopped screaming and was pressed against the far wall, its head down, its eyes rolled entirely white. Abigail moved toward it the way you move towards something that is afraid of you, slowly, with the full attention of someone who understands that speed here would be fatal. She spoke as she moved, low words she was not certain afterward what she said, possibly something from a Latin text she had taught, Possibly her mother's name, possibly just sounds that carried the frequency of calm she was manufacturing for a creature that needed it more than she did. The horse's head came up. She reached the latch, opened it. The horse went past her, and she turned to follow, and a hand closed on her arm. The man from the barn. He had circled around under cover of the smoke, and his face was black with soot, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has been humiliated twice in 12 hours and has decided that someone is going to pay for that. The revolver went to her temple. He dragged her toward the barn entrance. "Drop it." He was shouting toward the house, toward Lucas in the doorway, who had both rifles now despite the wounded shoulder and the blood that had soaked through the fresh bandaging. "Drop everything or I end her right here." Lucas set down one rifle, then the other, raised his hands. His face gave nothing. "Don't," Abigail said. "He'll kill us both anyway. It's the only—" Shut up." The gun pressed harder. Wade Prescott emerged from cover near the corral, revolver on Lucas, the confidence of a man who has arrived at the outcome he intended. "The journal," Wade said, "inside on the table. Go get it. You try anything, she dies first, then you." Lucas looked at Abigail. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, she saw him calculate the angles, the way a man calculates who has been in situations like this before and has survived them by being clear-eyed about what was possible and what was not. She saw him find something in her eyes that corresponded to something he was thinking. She saw him make a decision. Then he turned and walked back into the house. The man holding her relaxed, just fractionally, the loosening of someone who believes the critical moment has passed. It was enough. She threw herself backward, driving her elbow into his ribs on the side where Grace's candlestick had already introduced itself the night before. He gasped. The gun hand wavered, swinging away from her head. She grabbed the revolver with both hands and pushed it toward the sky. It fired the shot going up into the morning air above the burning barn, and they struggled with the full weight of desperation on one side and injured embarrassment on the other, and for a moment it was genuinely unclear which of those qualities was going to prove more durable. The shotgun blast came from the barn doorway. Lucas had circled through the burning building, using the smoke as cover emerging behind the man, while his attention was consumed by Abigail. The first barrel caught the man in the chest and he went down, and the silence that followed the shot was the complete silence that follows something final. Abigail fell backward onto the dirt, her ears ringing, the revolver still in her hands. She sat up to see Lucas diving behind the water trough as Wade fired 3 times in rapid succession, the bullets hitting the wood in a fast, furious pattern. Lucas came up with the second barrel of the shotgun. Wade threw himself sideways, rolled, came up behind the corral fence. Silence. The barn was fully engaged now, a column of fire and black smoke rising into the morning sky. "5 shots," Wade called out. His voice was still conversational, still pleasant in the way of a man conducting business under adverse conditions. "You're empty, Lucas." "So are you," Lucas called back, "unless you saved one." A beat. "Always save one," Wade said. "For old friends." He stood up from behind the corral fence, the revolver on Lucas over the top rail. Steady. The distance was 40 feet, and the shot was manageable, and Wade Prescott had been a very good shot for as long as Lucas had known him. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the rifle shot came from the ridge to the east. Wade Prescott looked down at the red spreading across his chest with the expression of a man encountering a calculation error in a sum he had considered final. He looked up at the ridge where the riders were appearing, now 5 of them moving at speed down the slope. He looked at Lucas. "Huh," he said, as if this were mildly interesting. Then he fell. Marshal Henry Carson was a tall man weathered in the specific way of someone who has spent 30 years enforcing law in country that had its own ideas about what law meant. His badge caught the morning sun as he came down from the ridge with his deputies behind him, and it was the most welcome piece of metal Abigail had ever seen. Behind Carson rode Grace Chin, sitting a horse with the posture of a woman who has been on one before and has things to do. And behind Grace, his arm in a makeshift sling and his white shirt dark at the shoulder, Reverend Whitfield. Alive. Abigail let out a breath that had been waiting for several hours. Carson dismounted, walked to where Wade lay, looked down at him with the dispassionate assessment of a man doing inventory. "Wade Prescott, federal warrant on him going back 4 years. Desertion, theft, murder." He looked at Lucas, who had come out from behind the water trough with the empty shotgun and the gray face of a man who has spent too much of himself in too short a time. Reckon the warrant's academic now. Wade tried to say something, produced instead a sound that had no words in it, then stopped producing anything. Grace dismounted and reached Abigail and examined her with efficient hands, turning her face toward the light, checking the arm the man had grabbed him, looking at the soot and the blood that had transferred from various sources during the preceding hours. You're bleeding. Not all of it's mine. Enough of it might be. Grace's hands moved to the side where the ribs were. Abigail winced without intending to. Grace's expression shifted slightly, the shift of someone confirming a suspicion. I'm fine, Abigail said. You keep saying that. I keep meaning it. One of these days, Grace said, you are going to mean it, and it will also be true. She stepped back. Reverend Whitfield. He took a bullet in the shoulder, not the chest. The blood made it look worse than it was. He'll heal. The relief of that moved through Abigail in a wave that she did not attempt to disguise. Reverend Whitfield himself was making his careful way across the yard, his one good eye fixed on Abigail, with an expression of dignity maintained at some cost. Miss Brennan, he said, I owe you an apology. For what? For not doing this 2 years ago when the first girl arrived. He stopped in front of her. Sometimes bearing witness is not enough. Sometimes a person has to be willing to do something about what they have witnessed regardless of the personal cost. He paused. You were willing from the moment you arrived. I could have learned something from that earlier. You stayed to cover Grace's exit, Abigail said. You took a bullet for it. One bullet, poorly placed from a man who was already frightened. He almost smiled. I have been hit harder by the opinion of my congregation. Carson had come to stand beside them, his hat in his hands, reading the situation with the practiced eye of a man who has spent 30 years showing up after things had already happened and learning to reconstruct the before from the after. Doc Morrison has been tracking disappearances for 2 years, he said. Sent me a detailed report 3 weeks ago. When your telegraph reached me last night saying it was urgent, I was already most of the way here. He looked at the burning barn, the body by the corral, the ranch house with its broken window and bullet-marked walls. Looks like 30 seconds late was almost fatal. Almost, Lucas said from where he had lowered himself to sit against the water trough. The color had not returned to his face, but the eyes remained sharp in the way that mattered. I have the journal, Abigail said. She reached inside her coat and brought it out. The leather was warm from being carried against her body through the night and the fire and everything that had followed. She held it out to Carson. Malcolm Pritchard's records. 2 years of them. Every name, every payment, every transfer to Black Creek Mine. And a notation at the end for Sarah Drummond Silas's niece, 17 years old, marked as resolved without payment. Carson took the journal, opened it, read the first page, then the second. His face did not change, which was the face of a man who had learned that the law required him to have a face that did not change in order to function. But something in his eyes said that what he was reading was exactly what he had spent 2 years accumulating enough evidence to go looking for. Black Creek Mine, he said, 40 miles north. We believe some of the women may still be there. Carson looked at his deputies. How long to reach it? Full day's ride, the nearest one said. Rough country toward the end. Then we leave within the hour. He looked at Lucas, who was making no convincing argument for his own incapacity. You're wounded. I'm functional. I'm going as well, Abigail said. Carson looked at her with the measured attention of a man assessing a claim. With respect, Miss Brennan, those women have been there for months. She met his eyes and held them the way she had learned to hold a position that mattered. When your deputies find them, they will be frightened. They will have every reason not to trust men with guns and badges because men with authority are what put them there. They need someone who arrived in this territory the same way they did, who understands what they made of their situation and why, who can tell them with genuine knowledge that it is over. She paused. I am that person. There is no other person here who is that person. Carson held her gaze for a moment. Then he said to his deputy, Mitchell, find her a horse. They rode north. The country changed with the altitude, the open range giving way to pine forests that came in first as suggestion and then as fact, the trees thickening around the trail until the light that reached the ground came through in columns and shafts rather than as continuous illumination. The air thinned and cooled and carried the particular clarity of high mountain country, the smell of pine resin and cold water, and the approaching season that had not yet fully arrived but was no longer pretending it would not. Lucas rode beside Abigail for most of the journey, not hovering, not protective in the way that prevented movement, but present in the way that steady things are present, providing a reference point without demanding to be centered on. They did not speak much during the middle hours. The terrain required attention, and there was a quality of mutual understanding between them now that had been earned through the night and the morning, in the burning barn, in the man in the alley that did not require the confirmation of words to remain valid. Around the middle of the afternoon, when they stopped to water the horses at a creek that came down from the ridge in a series of small falls, he broke the silence. Doc Morrison examined you this morning, while you were talking to Carson. I know. She has a way of examining people while appearing to be doing something else. I found it impressive. She said 3 ribs, broken months ago and healed badly. He looked at the creek. She said whoever broke them did it more than once. Abigail said nothing. The man in Boston, Lucas said, James Hartford. Yes. He was your fiancé. He was the man I agreed to marry before I understood the nature of the agreement, which was that I would provide whatever he needed financially and otherwise. And in exchange, I would receive protection from everything except him. She kept her voice even and clear, the way she kept it for certain truths. When my father died and the money that James had been anticipating as part of our arrangement failed to materialize, his view of the value of the agreement changed. When I declined to compensate for this through other means, he explained the consequences of that decision at some length. Lucas was quiet for a long time. The horses drank. The creek went over its stones. If James Hartford ever comes west, he said. You already said that. I wanted to say it again. He looked at her. Some things are worth saying twice. The coldness in his voice was not anger. It was something older and more deliberate than anger, the settled quality of a person who has decided something clearly and is not going to undecide it. They mounted and rode on. The mine appeared in the last hour of afternoon, carved into a hillside of exposed rock above the tree line, its wooden structures half collapsed and weathered to the color of old bones. 2 buildings showed smoke from their chimneys, which was the evidence of occupation that could not be hidden, no matter how much their occupants might prefer otherwise. Carson halted the group 200 yards out. We approach on foot. Quiet. He looked at each of them in turn. If there are guards, we take them without shooting if it's possible. If it is not possible, we make it quick. He looked at Abigail. You stay behind the first line until the building is secured. She agreed because it was a reasonable request and because the journal in Carson's saddlebag was already the victory that mattered most. And everything else was the work of making the victory real in the lives of the women who needed it to be real. They left the horses and moved forward through the last of the trees spread out in a loose line, Carson and his deputies at point. The first building was a bunkhouse. Through a gap in the boards, 4 men cards, lamplight weapons within reach. The kind of men who had been hired for a specific combination of capability and willingness to not ask questions about what exactly they were guarding or why the women behind the locked door needed to be locked. Carson positioned his men, counted silently, and put his boot through the door. 2 of the men went for their weapons. It was instinct, the instinct of men who had been in situations like this before and had survived them by responding first. It was also fatal in this instance because Carson's deputies had been in more of those situations and had responded to more of that instinct and were faster. The other 2 raised their hands. Where are the women? Carson said. Not a question, a statement requiring completion. One of the men looked at the other. Carson put a bullet through the floor between them. The mine, the older one said. Deep shaft. They keep them in the deep shaft. The mine entrance was absolute darkness beyond its first few yards, and then the electric lights began strung along the tunnel walls on a wire that ran to a generator, somewhere deeper in its chug, a constant presence in the background of everything like a heartbeat that belonged to the mountain itself. They went down. The air changed as they descended, becoming the air of deep places, the air that has not seen the sun in a very long time, and has taken on the qualities of the stone it is trapped in, cold and mineral and patient. The tunnel walls pressed closer as they went lower. The timbers holding up the rock above them had the look of things doing their job at the edge of what they could manage. Abigail moved behind Carson and his deputies with Lucas immediately behind her, and she was aware of the mountain above her in a way that was not quite fear, but was its precise neighbor, the awareness of what was up there and what was holding it up, and the margin of confidence available in that arrangement. 300 feet down the tunnel curved, and the sounds reached them. Women's voices, not calling out, the sounds of people who have been in a confined space for long enough that they have stopped expecting the sounds they make to reach anyone. Carson moved faster. The iron bars of the gate were visible around the next turn, a heavy construction set into the tunnel wall behind which a space perhaps 20 feet across held four women who looked up when the lantern light reached them with the specific expression of people who have been surprised by something they had stopped believing would happen. The youngest one was perhaps 16. She pressed herself against the back wall until she saw that the men in front had a badge, and then she began to cry in the way of someone who has been not crying for a very long time, and for whom the reversal of that effort is a full-body experience. "Please," she said, "please get us out." Carson examined the lock. "I need something to break this." Lucas aimed his rifle at the lock mechanism and fired. The bars swung open. Abigail went forward before anyone else moved because this was what she had come for, and she had not spent the night and the morning and the mountain road to stand at the back and observe it. She caught the youngest woman as she came through the doorway, put her arms around her, felt the shaking that ran through the girl like a current. "You're safe," she said. "We're taking you out of here." "Home." The girl's voice was hollow in a way that had nothing to do with the acoustics of the tunnel. "I don't have a home. That's why I came west." "Then we'll find you a new one." Abigail held her steady. "But first we get out of this mountain." The older of the four women, gray threading her hair, dark marks on her wrists where the ropes had been stepped forward. "There are more." Her voice had the quality of someone speaking in a controlled manner at the very edge of their control. "Another shaft, deeper. Silas keeps some of them separate. The ones who fought, the ones who knew things." Carson's jaw tightened. "How many?" "6. They took them 2 days ago, said they were going to the Canadian mines." She stopped. "But I heard the guards talking. They weren't going to the mines. They were going to be buried in a collapse, made to look like an accident." The silence that followed had the weight of the mountain in it. "Where is this shaft?" Carson said. "Deeper. Another 200 feet down." They went deeper. The tunnel narrowed further. The timbers more stressed. Small rocks working loose from the ceiling in a pattern that suggested the whole thing was an ongoing negotiation with gravity. Twice sections of wall came down in a rattle of stone that froze everyone in place until the settling stopped. Abigail's ribs were operating beyond the language of pain in the register of pure signal, a continuous communication from her body about the conditions it was being asked to function in. She processed the signal and kept moving. They found the false wall by the fresh tool marks in the rock exactly as Grace had predicted it would be, found because Grace had been right about most things for 2 years, and this was consistent with her record. Carson and Lucas pulled down the stacked stones, an iron gate, standing open. "Trap," Lucas said. "Yes," Carson said. "We're going in anyway." The shaft sloped downward at an angle that required bracing against the walls. At the bottom, a natural cavern opened around them, lit by torches arranged in a ring. Theatrical, deliberate, the lighting of a space prepared for an audience. 6 women bound to posts in the center of the light, ranging from perhaps 16 to 30. The expressions on their faces when they saw the approaching lanterns moved through a sequence that Abigail would not forget: hope, then the collapse of hope into the fear that hope was dangerous, then the cautious, terrible recalibration as the badge on Carson's chest came into the torchlight. And in the shadows at the edge of the torchlight, where the illumination stopped being useful shapes. Men, 8 of them she counted, positioned with the deliberate geometry of people who have been waiting. A figure stepped forward into the light. Not Silas. This man was perhaps 40, with a face that geological forces seemed to have had a hand in all planes and angles, and the look of something that had been broken and reset imprecisely. His suit was expensive and travel-stained. He moved with the confidence of authority, but it was a different quality of confidence from Silas's less smooth, more direct, the confidence of a man who solves problems with force rather than with systems. "Marshal Carson," his voice carried well in the cavern. "Right on time. I was beginning to think you might not come." Carson stopped. Victor Drummond, Silas's brother. Family business. The man smiled in a way that had nothing warm in it. I run the northern operation. Silas handles the sourcing. It's an efficient arrangement. He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness that sat poorly against the 8 guns at his back. Here's the situation as I see it. You want these women. I want you to turn around, ride back to Copperbend, tell the territorial court that the journal was a fabrication, and make sure my brother walks out of whatever holding situation he is currently in. A pause. In exchange, nobody in this cavern has an unpleasant evening. That's not happening, Carson said. Then everyone in this cavern has a very unpleasant evening. Victor gestured at the bound women. Your choice, Marshal. Justice or mercy. Men in your position are often surprised to discover they cannot have both at once. The standoff settled over the cavern like weather. Carson's deputies had their weapons on Victor's men. Victor's men had theirs on the women in the center. The torches threw light and shadow in equal measure, and the mountain pressed down from above with its complete indifference to the human drama at its feet. Abigail looked at the 6 women bound to the posts. She looked at the guns. She looked at Victor Drummond, at the calculation in his eyes, at the way he stood, with the confidence of a man who believes he has arranged the variables correctly. She walked forward. Miss Brennan, Lucas's voice from behind her, get back. She did not get back. She walked into the open space between the 2 groups, into the light of the torches, where everyone in the cavern could see her, and kept walking toward the bound women. Victor watched her approach with the interested expression of a man observing something he has not planned for. What exactly do you think you're doing? I'm doing what men with guns never think to do, she said. I'm making this personal. She reached the first woman. The ropes at her wrists were tight, deliberate. She began working at the knot. These are not leverage. She kept her voice level and clear, carrying it to every corner of the cavern, the way she had been trained to carry her voice across a classroom of 30 students. They are not inventory, they are not assets or liabilities or collateral, or any of the other words that men like you and men like your brother have been using for them. The first knot came free. She moved to the second woman. They are people. Every one of them came west on a promise. Every one of them was deceived. Every one of them has been here longer than any person should be anywhere against their will. You're testing my patience, Victor said. I'm testing your conscience. Third woman. Sarah Drummond was your niece, 17 years old. She came to Reverend Whitfield because she was frightened of her own family. Your brother sold her the way he sold everyone else, except in her case there was no payment because she wasn't a transaction, she was a problem being resolved. Fourth woman. Are you going to kill 6 more women to protect the man who did that to your own family's child? Something moved across Victor Drummond's face. Not softness. Something harder than softness, but related to it the way a scar is related to the wound beneath it. Sarah was weak, he said. She didn't understand what the business required. She was 17. Fifth woman. She understood exactly what it required. That's why she went to the Reverend. That's why she needed to be resolved. The last knot. 23 women, Mr. Drummond. That is how many your brother has sold in 2 years. How many you have received. How many you are prepared to add to when you kill these 6. She turned to face him, standing in front of all 6 women now, her back to them. So here is your actual choice. You shoot us and you become men who killed 10 people in a mine shaft with a federal marshal as witness, and every lawman in the territory hunts you until you hang. Or you let us walk out of here, and you and your men ride north, and whatever happens to you in Canada is whatever happens to you in Canada. She met his eyes. You cannot disappear into the dark if there is a witness, and there are many witnesses in this cavern. The silence stretched. Victor Drummond looked at his men. He looked at the women standing behind Abigail. He looked at Carson's deputies with their weapons drawn. He looked at the journal-shaped calculation of what had already been surrendered in Copper Bend. He looked at Abigail Brennan, who had arrived in Montana 4 days ago with 9 cents in a torn dress, and who was standing in the bottom of a mine shaft telling him what she saw when she looked at him. Hell with it, he said. He lowered his gun. Let them go. They're not worth dying over. His men hesitated. Then one by one the weapons came down. Carson moved immediately. Everyone out. Move. They retreated through the tunnel, Carson's men covering the rear, the freed women moving with the shaky, urgent steps of people rediscovering the use of their legs after long confinement. Behind them, Victor and his men did not follow. At the tunnel's mouth, the night air came at them like a gift. Abigail walked out into it and stopped and stood and breathed it for a moment, the cold, clean air of the Montana high country, and she felt the shaking begin in her hands and move up through her arms and into her chest, and she let it because there was nothing to be done about it and nowhere to hide it now that the part requiring steadiness was finished. Lucas was beside her, and that was, he said, the most reckless act of courage I have witnessed in my entire life. It worked, she said. It worked this time. This time was the time that mattered. He looked at her in the darkness, and she looked back at him, and the mountain was above them, and the rescued women were around them, and the torches at the mine entrance threw their light in warm, unsteady pulses, and what moved between them in that look was not something that required words to be real. "Don't do it again," he said. "I make no promises," she said. He almost smiled. It started to snow, light flakes at first finding their way down through the darkness, catching the torchlight, and turning briefly gold before settling on the rock and the pine and the upturned faces of 10 women breathing free air. Grace, who had materialized at the mine entrance with the inevitability of Grace appearing wherever she was most needed, had a fire going, and a pot over it with the efficiency of someone for whom the equipment of warmth and nourishment was always the first priority. Doc Morrison moved among the women with the contained urgency of someone working through a list and ticking items as she went. The 4 from the first shaft found the 6 from the second, and the recognition that moved through them when they understood that all of them had survived was something that did not have a clean name, but occupied the space where words fail and something older takes over. Abigail sat near the fire and let her body report its findings to her, and the findings were extensive. Lucas sat beside her close enough that the warmth of his presence was as real as the warmth of the fire, and said nothing which was the right thing to say. "We did it," she said finally. "You did it. I had assistance. You walked into a cavern with 8 guns and talked a man into standing down." He looked at the fire. "I was behind a rock with a rifle, and I was less useful than you were. You saved my life in that alley. You saved 3 horses from a burning barn. The horses were frightened. So were you." "Yes," she said, "but the horses couldn't help it." He looked at her. For the first time since she had arrived in Copper Bend in the firelight, at the entrance of a Montana mine while it snowed, Lucas Mercer looked at her without the careful management of distance that he had been maintaining since the moment she stepped off the stagecoach. Just looked with the full weight of someone who has decided somewhere below the level of announcement that the distance is no longer the point. "Doc Morrison wants to look at those ribs," he said. "Doc Morrison can wait 5 minutes. She said you're running on stubbornness and nothing else. Doc Morrison is very perceptive." They sat. The snow came down around them light and indifferent and beautiful, turning the mountain country silver. They came back down the mountain in the gray hour before full dawn, 10 women and 4 riders, and a federal marshal and his deputies, moving through the pine forest with the careful attention of people who have spent too much of themselves and are running on the last reserves of something that is not quite strength, but is the thing that substitutes for it when strength runs out. The snow had stopped sometime in the deep middle of the night. The world it left behind was clean in the way that only mountain country, after first snow is clean, every surface softened, every edge rounded, the whole landscape remade into something that looked like a fresh start, whether or not it actually was one. Abigail rode in the middle of the group, the youngest of the rescued women on the horse beside her, the girl who had said she had no home to go back to. Her name was Eleanor. She was 16 from Kentucky, and she had come west on letters she now understood had been written by a man named Harlan, who worked the same circuit Malcolm had worked recruiting for the same system. She had been at Black Creek Mine for 4 months. She did not talk much during the descent. Neither did Abigail. There was a quality of shared exhaustion between them that went beyond the physical, the exhaustion of people who have been running at the edge of what they could bear for long enough that the edge had become the ordinary condition, and who were now, for the first time in a long time, being permitted to stop running. At some point in the second hour of the ride, Eleanor reached across the space between their horses and took Abigail's hand, not in distress, not asking for something, simply placing her hand there the way a person reaches for something solid, when the ground has been unreliable for a long time. Abigail held it. They rode like that for the better part of a mile without either of them saying anything, and in that silence something passed between them that would have been diminished by being named. Copper Bend appeared below them as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, the town emerging from its valley with the particular quality of ordinary things that have no idea what has happened in the dark around them. Smoke from breakfast fires. The livery doors open, a dog investigating something of interest near the general store with the focused attention of a creature for which the world is always exactly as complicated as it needs to be and no more. Carson had sent his deputy Mitchell ahead at midnight with a telegraph to the territorial court and instructions to have the sheriff's office prepared for a prisoner transfer. Sheriff Tully, confronted with 5 federal deputies and a warrant signed by the territorial judge, had apparently decided that his long habit of looking into his coffee cup could be extended to cover this situation as well, and had vacated his office without being asked twice. The Silver Dollar was not yet open for business at this hour. It would not open today at all. Carson posted 2 deputies at the front entrance and 2 at the rear, and walked through the front door of the Silver Dollar Saloon at 7:14 in the morning, with the manner of a man doing something he has been waiting a considerable time to do and intends to do correctly. Abigail watched from across the street. She had not been asked to witness this. She had positioned herself to witness it anyway because she had earned the right to see it, and no one with any sense was going to tell her otherwise. Through the saloon window, she could see the shape of Silas Drummond at his usual table at the back of the room. He was having breakfast. This detail struck her as exactly right, as perfectly characteristic of the man, that he would be having breakfast while the walls came down around him, that his response to the arrival of a federal marshal and 5 deputies would be to set his coffee cup down with unhurried precision and reach for his napkin. He was handcuffed at 7:17. He walked out of the Silver Dollar under his own power, which was also characteristic. He did not struggle. He did not protest. He looked at the small crowd that had gathered on the street, Grace Reverend Whitfield with his arm in a proper sling, now Doc Morrison, the 10 rescued women standing in a loose group with the particular posture of people trying to take up exactly the space they are entitled to, and not an inch less, and he looked at each of them in turn, with the pale blue eyes that had spent so long performing warmth, they had forgotten how to do anything else. When his gaze reached Abigail, it paused. She held it. She did not look away. She did not look down. She stood in the main street of Copper Bend in a borrowed coat with soot still in her hair and 3 ribs that had never healed correctly, and she looked at the man who had written her name in a ledger as a line item, and she held his gaze until he was the one who looked elsewhere. It was not a triumph. It was too quiet for triumph, too personal, too specific. It was something smaller and more durable than triumph. It was the simple, hard-won fact of still being there. Carson put Silas Drummond into the back of the wagon at 7:19. Grace, standing beside Abigail, exhaled. 2 years, she said. Yes. I kept a list, every name, every date, everything I saw and couldn't prove. She paused. I thought there would be more to this moment. There usually is less, Abigail said. The big things always feel smaller in person. It's afterward that they become what they were. Grace looked at her. Boston educated you well, she said. The corner of her mouth moved. For certain things. The jail occupied a building beside the sheriff's office, 3 cells in a row behind a heavy door that had been built with more seriousness than most of the rest of the town's construction, as if whoever built it had anticipated needing it to actually hold someone someday. Silas was in the middle cell by noon. Carson had left 2 deputies on rotation and had gone to arrange the paperwork for the territorial court circuit, which would convene in 3 weeks. The charges were specific, documented, and supported by a journal that had been in federal custody since the morning. Lucas went to the jail at 9 o'clock that evening. Abigail knew he would. She had known it since the moment Carson put Silas in the wagon, and she had watched Lucas watch it happen from across the street, had watched his face do the controlled, careful work of containing something that was not going to be containable indefinitely. She had given him the day. She had given him the evening. When the hour reached 9 and she had not seen him return to the hotel where Carson had arranged rooms for the group, she put on her coat and walked to the jail. The deputy at the door looked at her. He went in 15 minutes ago, the deputy said. Said he wanted a word. I know. She looked at the door. "I'd like a word as well." The deputy considered this for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether a situation falls within his standing orders or outside them. "5 minutes," he said and opened the door. She went in. The jail's interior was lit by two oil lamps that created pools of orange light with darkness between them. Lucas was standing in front of the middle cell with his back to the door. His right hand was on the bar. His left arm was still in the sling, the wound dressed properly now by Doc Morrison's careful hands. In the cell, Silas sat on the edge of the cot with the posture of a man conducting a meeting in a venue that is beneath his usual standard, but is making the best of it. He looked up when Abigail entered. His expression did not change. Lucas did not turn. The air and the space between them had the particular quality of a conversation that has already happened, has said what it needed to say, and has left both parties standing in the aftermath of it. Abigail moved to stand beside Lucas. Not behind him, beside him. She looked at Silas. Silas looked back at both of them with those pale eyes that had learned to perform warmth and had stopped performing it now that there was no audience worth performing for. "He told you," Abigail said. Not a question. Lucas said nothing. His hand on the bar was not quite a grip, not quite a fist, something between the two, something that had not resolved itself into either. "I did," Silas said pleasantly. "I find that the truth delivered at the right moment is more effective than almost any other weapon. Lucas has spent 3 years hating the right man for the wrong reason. That is a particular kind of waste." He tilted his head slightly. "The Comanche raid was exactly what it was reported to be. I was in Helena. I had approximately 40 witnesses to my location. The raid had nothing to do with me." A pause beneath this. "I simply found it useful to allow him to believe otherwise." "Why are you telling him now?" Abigail said. "Because I have nothing left to gain from the alternative." Silas looked at Lucas with the expression of a man performing an honest assessment. "And because it is the one thing I can do to him that the law cannot undo. The journal takes my business. The court takes my freedom. But this," he gestured at the space between Lucas and the cell, "this I can give him for free." Abigail understood then completely and without ambiguity what Silas was doing. He was not confessing out of conscience. He was making one final transaction. The information he was offering was not truth freely given. It was a weapon deployed with precision designed to do to Lucas what the law could not, to take from him the story that had organized 3 years of grief and guilt and replace it with nothing. No villain, no reason, no meaning. Just the random cruelty of a frontier afternoon and 2 graves on a hill. She looked at Lucas. His face was doing something she had not seen it do before. Not the controlled stillness of management, not the deliberate blankness of a man keeping weather out. This was the face of a man who has been carrying a structure that has just been removed and who is discovering in this moment what was actually underneath the structure. His hand came off the bar. He turned slightly, not toward Silas, away from him, toward the wall, the floor, the middle distance of a man recalibrating. She watched him do it. She did not speak. She did not reach for him. She gave him the room that it required, the way she had learned to give room to things that needed it, because some things collapse more cleanly if you don't try to catch them. 40 seconds of silence. Then Lucas turned back to the cell. His face had settled into something she had not seen before on him. Something that had the quality of a decision made and accepted not with peace securely, but with the kind of clarity that comes after a very long time of not being clear. "You're right about one thing," he said. His voice was quiet, the particular quiet of something that does not need volume. "Their deaths had no meaning. The universe is exactly as cruel and random as you say it is." He looked at Silas without the heat of 3 years in it, without the accusation or the grief or the accumulated weight of everything he had believed and organized his life around. Just looked with the simple, direct attention of a man seeing something accurately for the first time. "But 10 women rode down that mountain this morning. They have names and ages and the rest of their lives in front of them because of what happened in the past 4 days. That has meaning. That is what I will remember when I watch you hang." He turned and walked toward the door. Abigail stood for one more moment in front of the cell. She looked at Silas Drummond, at the pale eyes that were watching Lucas's retreating back, with the expression of a man who has thrown his last card and is watching it land somewhere other than where he intended. She said nothing to him. There was nothing worth saying. She followed Lucas out. The night air outside the jail was cold and clear. The stars overhead, with the particular brilliance of high altitude, more of them visible than seemed reasonable, as if the sky had been showing restraint on behalf of people who were too occupied to look up and was now making up for lost time. Lucas was standing in front of the jail, with his face tilted upward, slightly not looking at the stars exactly, just looking at the dark between them. Abigail stood beside him. After a moment, she said, "He wanted you to feel that there was no meaning to any of it, that the random cruelty of it made everything else meaningless too." "Yes." "Does it?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't. It makes what we did yesterday mean more, not less. If nothing is arranged, if nothing is guaranteed, then the things that people choose to do for each other are the only meaning there is." He looked at her. 10 women. That's real. That happened. Whatever else is or isn't true, that happened. The night was very quiet around them. Somewhere down the main street, the sounds of Grace's restaurant still open, late voices, lamplight. The mountains beyond the roof lines were visible as darker shapes against the dark sky, enormous and patient and completely indifferent to the human drama at their feet, which was, Abigail had come to understand, not a failing of the mountains, but simply their nature. "What will you do," she said, "now that you know?" He thought about it for longer than a quick answer would have required. "Go home," he said. "Fix the barn. The winter is coming, and there is work to do." A pause. "I have been waiting for 3 years to act. Now I have acted, and the waiting is over, and what is left is the ordinary work of living." He looked at the mountains. "I had forgotten that ordinary work is not a lesser thing. It is the thing. It is what Anna and Lily were doing when they were alive." He stopped. "I forgot that for a while." The grief in his voice as he said their names was different from any grief she had heard from him before. Not the contained, managed thing it had been. Not the guilt in the shape of grief that she had read on his face in the cemetery on the first night. This was the grief itself, simple and clean. The grief of someone who loved people who are gone and knows it and does not need to make it into anything other than what it is. She said, "I'm sorry about Anna and Lily. Not the way everyone is sorry. I mean that I'm sorry you lost them specifically. That those two specific people are not in the world." He looked at her. Something moved in the gray eyes that had been so carefully managed for so long that she had stopped expecting to see it move. "Thank you," he said, and meant it simply, without the weight of everything else it might have carried. They stood in silence for another minute. Then Lucas said, not looking at her, looking at the mountains, "The room behind the church." "Yes." "Is it what you want? On a permanent basis?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "The window looks out over the cemetery," she said, "which I was initially told people find discouraging." "Do you find it discouraging?" "Less than I expected." A pause. "Though I have noticed that it is not the only available view in Copper Bend." He turned to look at her then. She was already looking at him. The Montana night was enormous around them, and the stars were extraordinary, and the cold had the particular quality of cold that makes everything feel very specific, very present, very real. And what passed between them in the look was the same thing that had been building since the morning she poured his coffee without being asked and told him that waiting was not a plan. "I have a ranch," he said, 12 miles south. It needs work. The barn is ash. There are 2 chairs by the fireplace and a table that seats 4, a room with a window that looks at the mountains." He paused. "It is not a transaction. It is not an arrangement. I am not Malcolm Pritchard, and I am not offering you a ledger entry." The directness of him in this moment was the same directness he brought to everything, the quality of a man who does not know how to be indirect about the things that matter. "I am asking if you want to build something. With me. Whatever that looks like over time." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "That is," she said, "the least romantic proposal in the recorded history of the Montana Territory." Something happened to his face. Not quite a smile, but the full version of the thing she had been seeing fragments of for 4 days, the thing that had been present behind the controlled weather of him, waiting for the conditions that would allow it. "I was not aware I was proposing," he said. "You were proposing. I was asking a practical question about living arrangements. You were proposing Lucas. A beat of silence. Well, he said, the answer yes or no. She looked at him. She thought about 9 cents and a broken promise and a stagecoach pulling away in a cloud of Montana dust. She thought about a room with a window over a cemetery and a woman who had kept a list for 2 years and a one-eyed reverend who understood that bearing witness was not enough. She thought about a journal hidden against broken ribs and 12 miles of dark river in a burning barn and 10 women breathing free air in falling snow. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere with nothing and find that the nothing was not the end of the story but the beginning of it. Yes, she said, the answer is yes. He looked at her for a long moment with the full weight of the gray eyes that had been measuring the weather of everything for 3 years and had finally found something worth settling on. Good, he said. It was not a word that announced itself. It was just a word quietly said with the weight of everything behind it that did not need to be said out loud because it was already known by both of them in the particular way that things are known when they have been earned rather than given. He went alone. She knew this was right. Some things are private in the way of the first things and last things, the moments at the borders of before and after. And what Lucas Mercer needed to say to two graves on a hillside in the Montana night was not the kind of thing that required an audience. She watched from the window of her room behind the church, the same window she had watched from on the first night when she had seen a man sitting with his dead in the moonlight and had read guilt in the line of his shoulders. Tonight, the line of his shoulders was different. He stood in front of the two markers for a long time with his hat in his hands and the stars overhead and the cold moving through the grass around him. She could not hear him. She did not need to. The conversation he was having belonged to him and to them and to the particular language of people who have loved each other and have things to settle before they can move. She had some sense of what he was saying, not the words but the shape of it, that the random cruelty of the world had taken them, and he understood now that he could not have prevented it and had been wrong to spend 3 years believing otherwise. That the guilt had been a kind of company, a way of keeping them present, and he was learning to keep them present in a different way, now a way that did not require him to be dead alongside them. That there was a woman from Boston who was going to ask him 40 questions at breakfast every morning for the rest of his life, and who would have made Anna laugh, and who Lily would have appointed as an immediate authority on all matters of proper ranch management. That he was going to try. He stood there for a long time. When he finally turned to leave, Abigail stepped back from the window, not because she did not want to see his face, because she had already seen what she needed to see, which was not an expression but a posture. The posture of a man who has set something down after carrying it for so long that he had forgotten he was carrying it. He was walking differently. Not much. Barely perceptibly. But she had cataloged the way Lucas Mercer moved through spaces with the attention of a woman who had learned to read rooms for survival, and she saw it the fractional unburdening of a man who has put down something heavy and is discovering step by step what it feels like to move without it. She stepped away from the window and sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room with its handmade quilt and its view of the cemetery, and she stayed with the silence of it for a while. Then she picked up her journal. Her own journal, not Malcolm's. She opened it to a fresh page. She wrote one line, 9 cents and a broken promise, and it turns out that was the beginning. She set down the pen. She looked out the window at the cemetery going silver in the moonlight, at the two markers on the hillside at the Montana night, enormous and indifferent and beautiful above all of it. She went to sleep. For the first time since Boston, she did not dream about walls. The school sat on the eastern edge of the ranch property where the meadow opened toward the mountains, and the morning light came in at the angle that made everything look like the beginning of something. Lucas had built it in the second year, not because there were yet enough children to fill it, but because Abigail had said that if you build the thing tends to arrive, and she had been right about enough things by then that he had learned to apply her logic before arguing with it. By the spring of 1887, there were 14 children in the school on weekday mornings, and Abigail taught them Latin and composition and mathematics and the history of the world, which was a large subject for a small building, but she had always believed that the size of the container was not the point. The ranch was 400 acres now. Lucas had bought the adjacent land and parcels as it became available, not from ambition exactly, but from the pragmatic recognition that land in Montana did not stay unclaimed for long, and that a person who intended to remain should invest in remaining. The cattle herd was solid. The horses were better than solid. Johnny, who was 15 now and had come to them in the third year from a situation in Billings that did not bear describing in detail, had a gift with horses that went beyond training into something that looked more like conversation. And Lucas had stopped pretending to supervise what Johnny did with the stock and simply watched and learned. Samuel was 8. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn jaw and an opinion about everything that he delivered, with the confidence of someone who has not yet learned that confidence requires occasional recalibration. He was currently at the yard attempting to demonstrate to Lucas the correct method of mending a fence post, which was the same method Lucas had been using for 15 years, delivered back to him with the authority of someone who had read about it in a book. "The angle is wrong," Samuel said. "The angle has been working for 15 years. That doesn't mean it's right, it means you've been lucky." Lucas looked at Abigail, who was coming across the yard from the school, with the expression of a woman who has been listening to this conversation from 20 feet away and is finding it satisfying. "He has a point," she said. "You told him to say that." "I told him to think for himself. He came to the point independently." She stopped beside Lucas and looked at the fence post and then at Samuel's demonstration with the focus of someone conducting a genuine assessment. "Actually, your angle is wrong. Samuel's is better." Lucas looked at the fence post. He looked at his son. He looked at his wife. "I have been managing this ranch," he said, "for 16 years. "And you have been mending fence posts incorrectly for 16 years, Abigail said. "The ranch's success is despite the fence posts, not because of them." Samuel vindicated applied his angle to the post with the satisfaction of the righteous. Lucas watched him for a moment. Something moved through his face that had become its ordinary expression over the past decade. Something that was not quite a smile, but occupied all of the same space. The expression of a man who has discovered somewhere in the middle of ordinary life that the ordinary is not a diminishment of the extraordinary, but is the form the extraordinary takes when it decides to last. He looked at Abigail. She was watching Samuel work. Her arms crossed her profile against the spring morning, with the mountains behind her. The green eyes that had been assessing rooms for danger for so long, now assessing fence post angles with the same focused attention, because Abigail brought the same quality of attention to everything and had brought it to the ranch and the school and the community and to him every day for 10 years without diminishment. The ribs had healed finally in the third year when Doc Morrison had found a doctor from Helena who knew what to do with bones that had been broken badly and set badly and needed to be approached with patience and the right kind of pressure. It had been a difficult 3 months. Abigail had described the process as an extended negotiation between my skeleton and someone who refuses to accept no for an answer, which Lucas had understood to be her description of Doc Morrison and also possibly of herself. She stood differently now, had for years. The careful accounting for the ribs, the deliberate steadiness of someone managing pain, had been replaced by the ordinary posture of a woman who is simply standing in the world without having to calculate the cost of it. He had noticed this the morning it happened, the first morning she stood at the kitchen window without the hand at her side, and he had not said anything about it because Abigail had made clear early in their acquaintance that some things were better honored with silence than with words. But he had noticed. He still noticed. That evening, after Samuel was in bed and Johnny had finished with the horses, and the school was dark, and the ranch had settled into its nighttime rhythms of wind and cattle, and the creek running low after a dry spring, Abigail sat on the porch with her journal and the last of the light, and Lucas came out and sat beside her with 2 cups of coffee and the comfortable silence of people who have been together long enough that silence is a form of conversation. The mountains were going from gold to raw to the deep blue that preceded dark. The first stars were appearing above the eastern ridge. Somewhere in the near meadow, the horses were moving through the grass with the soft, purposeful sound of large content animals conducting their evening business. Clara Whitmore had written last month from Oregon, where she had married a school teacher and was running the household accounts for a small logging operation with the precision that her letter said had been the only skill she had retained from the months before Copper Bend. She wrote every year. She had written every year since 1877. Mary Callahan was in California. Abigail had heard from Grace, who maintained a correspondence network across the Western Territories, with the systematic thoroughness she brought to everything. Mary had a restaurant in San Francisco. A good one, apparently. Grace had described it as adequately managed, which is high praise from me. Catherine Marsh had gone east. Back to Illinois to the family that had not known she was missing because she had not told them she was going for reasons that were hers alone to understand. She had sent one letter to Grace's restaurant in Copper Bend with no return address that said simply, "I am well. Thank you for coming." Of Sarah Drummond, the niece, there was no confirmed word. There were rumors, the kind that travel along the informal networks that women maintain across distances that official records do not reach. A girl matching her description working in a dress shop in Denver. A woman of the right age and coloring seen in the company of a Quaker family heading for Kansas. Abigail kept these rumors in the back of her journal, not because she expected resolution, because the alternative was to stop looking and that she was not prepared to do. Silas Drummond had hanged in Helena in the spring of 1877. The trial had lasted 4 days. The journal had been the foundation of the prosecution's case, supplemented by testimony from 6 of the 10 rescued women who had chosen to give it. The territorial court had found him guilty on 14 counts. He had walked to the gallows with the same controlled, deliberate posture he had brought to everything, and he had died with the pale eyes open, which someone reported at the time as defiant, and which Abigail, hearing the report, had understood simply as characteristic. Victor Drummond had ridden north as agreed. There were warrants. They had not been served. Canada was large and Victor was careful, and the territorial marshal's resources were finite. Lucas had asked Carson about it once in the second year, and Carson had said what Carson said about most things that were true but inconvenient. The world is not perfectly just. Our job is to move the average. Abigail had written that down. She looked at the mountains going dark. Lucas was reading something, one of Samuel's books that had been left on the porch chair, holding it at the angle his eyes required now that the light was going. She watched him for a moment without him knowing she was watching, the way she still sometimes did, the way she suspected she always would, with the particular attention of someone who has learned not to take for granted the presence of things that matter. He looked up and caught her looking. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She looked back at the mountains. "Everything. Nothing. How far we've come." He set the book down. From 9 cents to all this. She looked at the ranch, at the 400 acres going blue in the evening light, at the school with its dark windows, at the meadow, and the horses, and the mountains, and the stars beginning to show above the eastern ridge. She thought about Eleanor, who was 26 now and teaching school in Wyoming, and who wrote twice a year with news of her students and a regularity that Abigail found deeply satisfying. She thought about the fence post and Samuel's angle, and Johnny and the horses, and Doc Morrison's doctor from Helena, and 2 graves on a hillside that still had fresh wildflowers on them every spring, because Abigail put them there, because some things should be remembered by the living, even if the dead are beyond needing it. She thought about a stagecoach pulling away in a cloud of dust, and 9 cents in a coat pocket, in a room with a window over a cemetery, and a man with gray eyes who had looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has not yet decided how to solve. "From 9 cents to everything that matters," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand, the way Eleanor had taken her hand on the mountain road 10 years ago, not asking for anything, simply placing it there, the way you reach for something solid when you have learned finally that the ground beneath you holds. They sat as the dark came down over the mountains, and the stars filled in, and the ranch settled around them with all of its accumulated life and weight in ordinary, extraordinary dailiness. The girl from Boston was gone. In her place stood a woman of Montana who had arrived with 9 cents and a broken promise and had turned them into a legacy. Not because someone had armed her, not because the world had arranged itself in her favor, because she had chosen at every moment when the alternative was available not to be destroyed. The winter that followed her arrival in Copper Bend had been the hardest in a decade. The spring after it was the most beautiful anyone in the territory could remember. That was not a metaphor, or perhaps it was. Perhaps it was both at once, the way most true things are. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is the beginning of the best thing, but only if you are stubborn enough not to stop.